Hey, what's up, everyone? Hope you're well. Here to introduce to you guys episode number 16 of the Rooster's Crow podcast. I was very blessed to have Joel Davis with me, all the way from Australia, to discuss a lot of different things. We have quite a bit of overlap in terms of our interest in philosophy. Heidegger, Bergson, and Deleuze especially, who we talked about at length in many different ways that I think are a little unexpected. We also talked about his current conversion to Catholicism, which I was surprised to hear actually, and very pleased. And we talked about that and what that's been like. I think I might title this something like Deleuze as Endgame and for Western philosophical reflections, right? We both had this kind of conversion after reading Deleuze really heavily kind of towards Christianity, and he is a very anti-theist, postmodern atheist type guy, right? But it's like after you read him, you kind of defeat the boss of Western metaphysics, and then there's kind of nowhere else to go. But really enjoyed it. I hope you guys do too. Really great conversation touching on a lot of topics. So without further ado, I give to you guys Joel Davis. Thanks. God bless you. All right. So welcome to this episode of the Rooster's Crow podcast. I am very happy and blessed to have with me Mr. Joel Davis, all the way from Australia. Joel, thanks for joining me, sir.
Oh, it's no problem.
How's your day going?
Well, it's just beginning. It's 7:30 in the morning here, so.
Yeah. What time do you usually do these, or do you usually set them up morning time for you? Is that kind of how it
Well, because I deal with Americans a lot, yeah, usually my mornings correspond to your evenings, but I'm also a bit of a night owl, so sometimes if I do it the other way around. I'll stay up till 2 o'clock in the morning to plug into the American early day.
yeah. Yeah, I'd love to hear your kind of just general perspective of what you see happening, way across the pond there. But I'd like to get in first, and you can get into as much detail as you like, is kind of your background. Where did you grow up, and what was it like growing up? What were your parents like in terms of their political and religious views?
Yeah, so I mean, I grew up in Australia. My parents were like kind of normie Protestants, I guess you could say. So I was raised in church, in like a Protestant church, which I took relatively seriously as a child. And They didn't really express strong political views to me in either direction. They were Gen Xers, so they lived in this like world of the 80s and the 90s, like the, Fukuyama's end of history, so to speak, where like politics no longer really mattered and it was just some bullshit that, you know, that the average person didn't really need to care about that much. Um, and so that was, but I was always interested in politics, but I had to kind of form my political views myself based on my own kind of instinctual drive to learn about it as a child. I remember, you know, uh, telling my parents how to vote when I was like 12 or something, and they would listen to what I said because they just thought I had put more thought into it than they had. So that was kind of interesting, I guess. But anyway, yeah, like so. Uh, my childhood was kind of, I guess, more or less like normal upper middle class white person type shit. My dad was like a bit like a successful executive businessman.
Mhm.
Um, my mom ended up becoming an executive businessman after like my siblings and I grew up herself, and or I should businesswoman, I should say, or whatever. My mom's a bit of a girl boss, I guess. Um, but So like in terms of like provision, my family always provided to me, I guess you could say, a good life. But in terms of the other aspect of parenting, I never really got much direction from them in terms of the kind of person that I should be.
Mhm.
So that the main issue really was that my dad was a pussy and my mom was a bitch. So my mom used to kind of wear the pants, and then my dad would, you know, be kind of passive aggressive and douchey. Mum would like break his balls all the time, and then when she wasn't around, he'd take it out on me because like I was like the easy target for his frustration.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and anyway, their relationship was a bit of a mess. And so in my teens, I kind of challenged their authority. Um, my dad did not respond well to it. I think ultimately my challenging his authority led to my parents splitting up when I was in my late teens.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and because basically, he felt like my mother respected me more than him as like as a man, even though I was like 16 or whatever. And we got into altercations quite often. So yeah, I ended up becoming a rebellious teenager. I kind of stopped being faithful to Christianity. I took the like the Christopher Hitchens red pills and shit. Like
Four
the like
Horsemen.
Fedora, yeah, the Fedora tier like Reddit BS arguments. And I was really into like punk rock and shit like that. And uh, I got into like anarchism, like far left wing anarchism. And what alienated me from anarchism, like I used to read like Marx and Bakunin and Kropotkin and all these like 19th century authors, and then I would like meet actual anarchists, and they were all like proto, like they were like the early vestiges of this new woke discourse. Like they had like got the doubt, like the programming early, so they were already like into transgenderism and like hardcore feminism and shit, like to a really like extreme extent. And this is back in the 2000s, like particularly in Australia, this stuff wasn't like in yet. Gay marriage was still illegal. Like I didn't even know what a tranny was. You know what I mean? Like I didn't even know that was a thing until my mid-teens. And so that was kind of confronting. And even though I was like an anarchist and like a leftist, I was like anti-globalist, like, yeah, fuck the system. Let's throw Molotovs at cop cars and like fuck the corporations, man, or whatever. But, you know, I was kind of taken aback by feminism because even though I was a leftist, I didn't really respect women, so like, I didn't get along very well with them. We had some pretty like large arguments and fights. And but I kind of like hung out on all these like anarchist discussion areas on the internet. So then I got into anarcho-capitalism because I found them to be, even though I wasn't too sure about the capitalism part, I found them to be kind of more sane
Mm-hmm.
and genuine. Um, but I never quite fit because I was like red pilled on a lot of I guess left wing economic ideas, and I didn't really believe uh, the BS so much with like kind of like the ANCAP philosophy. So then I got into my later teens, and like even when I was a leftist during this time, I always thought like Hitler memes were funny. I always thought being politically incorrect was funny. I always thought racism, like, because the thing was that growing up in Australia with racism, we don't really have black people here. Like we have Aboriginals, but they didn't, like I didn't know any of them.
Mm-hmm.
They exist in these low income peripheral areas or like out of the major cities, so you don't really deal with them. And if we did have any black people you did meet was like a kind of immigrant from like Nigeria or something. So there's no like context of slavery, or the whole American context doesn't really exist around them. And yeah, so like the kinds of like kind of like hegemonic American discourse about racism wasn't that relevant to us. We were dealing with Muslims, Indians, Chinese, and so I grew up with a kind of soft racism against all these groups that was kind of normal, and it kind of it didn't, there wasn't really much cognitive dissonance between being a normal person and feeling kind of racially alienated from these different groups growing up. Um, so I always thought racism was funny, basically, is my point. And so when I kind of encountered, the 2014, 2015 emergence of like Chan culture kind of politicizing itself and like the alt-right emerging, Trump running for president, and this like libertarian to reactionary pipeline being set up. Obviously, I was into libertarian discourse, and then you come across things like Moldbug's work or like the whole neo-reactionary thing and various other kind of sub-movements, where you see this emptying out of the people that voted for like Ron Paul in 2012. I remember like 2012 YouTube, you could watch all these videos on like how 9/11 was an inside job. Then you'd have like Ron Paul videos and the suggested videos or whatever. And like I was into conspiracy theories, and so like that was like the cool politics of that time, watching Alex Jones or something. And then you accelerate forward a few years, and like it became more explicitly right wing. The culture had moved, all of this stuff that was kind of very peripheral in because like in the 2000s, it was still a little bit of this Fukuyama end of history shit. Like I was watching Friends with my girlfriend the other day, uh, which is cringe. I guess she made me watch it because I make her watch Seinfeld, and it was like so weird to notice how there's like no politics. Like and everyone's white pretty much in the whole show, and no one even brings up, like they just assume that like men don't want to, like that there's no, that you just assume that men don't want to be referred to as gay. That like not that there's anything wrong with that. They don't even have to put that in.
Mhm.
They don't have to. They don't have to like create any of these platitudes. They can just imagine normal white heterosexual people doing normal white heterosexual shit. And so it was kind of interesting to see that, because you'd never get a show like that these days. And that was like the biggest sitcom on TV back in like the early 2000s or whatever. So anyway, that started to change, and like this kind of like woke culture came online in a big way. And so there was a kind of reaction to that. And so I kind of got swept up in that and got into um, I guess like far right politics around that time.
Mhm.
And then at the same time also I was kind of getting over my rebellious phase as a kid, trying to like stop doing drugs, stop partying all the time, and like try and build a life, build a career, become a normal person.
Mhm.
I remember when I was like 15, I used to think like, oh, like these douchebag boomers who just get up every morning and like mow the lawn and work 9 to 5 at some office job, like so they can have their 2.3 kids in like the upper white middle class suburb. Like, man, that shit sucks, man. I don't want to be a slave to the system like these faggots. Now I'm like, man, that shit's gold. Like, that's the dream. Like uh it's like it seems like it's getting harder and harder to even have that,
Mhm.
so it's kind of funny. But yeah, so I kind of had this desire to kind of become more normal. And I started reading philosophy, and like started getting into these different political movements, and then ended up on YouTube and like creating, getting involved in different research projects, different fringe groups. Um, and so, yeah, now basically what I'm trying to do is to kind of professionalize some kind of role as like a kind of intellectual administrator of vanguardism. Like, I think we need to create a vanguard of intellectuals and artists that promote and create, uh, you know, cultural products, theoretical products, artistic products that ultimately affirm um, a kind of a different meaning to who we are than what is kind of being offered by the dominant hegemonic discourse that's promoted by the powers that be, which I'm finding to be increasingly sociopathic and increasingly like just malevolent, to be honest, towards the average person and being able to live a normal life. Um, so I guess, yeah, I don't know if that really answers your question.
Yeah, very much so. That was great, man. That was great. I think there's a lot of resonances with my life, and a lot of the people that I've talked to. I've had probably almost 20 episodes, and almost everyone that I talk to, when I ask them about their religious kind of upbringing, almost without fail, they say this in terms of they think it's a unique thing. They say, when I was young, I was really into the Bible, or I was really into Christ, or my parents' religion. And it always seems like that. The feeling I get is that I found out, or I felt that my parents didn't really believe, like, and then I kind of fell away from it too. So the question, I was talking with someone last week, and it's like this rebellious, teenage rebellion. I was asking kind of what are the roots of that? What do you think that comes from? And he kind of gave a unique answer. And I don't know about unique, but he said that, when you see your parents that can't put shit together in a terms of a marriage, right? It makes you kind of question authority, and that reaches all up and down the edifice, right? What do you think is the root of the kind of rebellious spirit that teenagers go through?
Yeah, like we have this like meme like promoted by the boomer generation, who were, degenerate hippies. And in my view, based on the research that I understand, the 60s counterculture that was what MK Ultra was. That was the psyop. They so-called mind control techniques was literally just research into how to establish the counterculture, promoting psychedelic drugs, and certain cultural attitudes, and all the rest of it. So like they were this generation that was corrupted by this massive psyop, and then we have this meme that, oh, it's just what teenagers do. They rebel against the older generation. I reckon that's bullshit. I don't think that's what teenagers naturally do.
Mm-hmm.
Because if it was, like civilizations wouldn't last as long as they do.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, I mean, the idea of like the marriage. I mean, the Bible teaches that the wife and the husband should give themselves over to one another, like Christ and the church give themselves over to one another. And so, in like the Christian worldview, if ultimately like all authority is with Christ, and the church derives its authority from its subordination to Christ, this obviously implies a pretty like intense uh, idea of what marriage is supposed to be, what traditional gender roles are supposed to be, which just don't exist anymore.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so, I mean, even if your parents stay together, what I always found with my parents was that my dad, like, my mother did not submit to my father. My father didn't know how to how to kind of demand and gain the position of authority that he should have, because he didn't have his authority wasn't grounded in his own kind of righteousness, his own understanding of what right and wrong was, that he should have received ultimately from his father and from the traditions that were passed down to him. And so he was unable to control his wife, my mother, and unable to control me, his firstborn son, and unable to kind of lead by example.
Mm-hmm.
And so ultimately everything kind of falls apart from there. Like, yes, it is a sin to disobey your parents, but if your parents don't give you a like coherent idea of what the fuck you're supposed to do, like what does it mean to be a good man, like what is it like, uh, what values are you supposed to have, how are you supposed to treat people, if you see them completely unable to answer these questions for themselves. Because my dad, in when I was growing up as a teenager, he was into like, we used to bond like in the way that you would bond with friends, like through like watching sports or like playing video games and shit. Like he was a man child in many ways. And So there was no sense of like, no strong sense of authority, that put everything in its place. And so I think ultimately, when you get of age and you get a bit of testosterone juicing around your body, and you ultimately, if there's no authority to look up to kind of emulate and embed that within, as well as like going to high school, like a lot of the teachers were either like beta faggots or women, that were kind of like center left types. There was no like strong masculine influence that I really had that I could look up to and say, yeah, I want to be like this guy. I looked up to like rock stars and like degenerates or whatever in culture that seemed cool, or like you know you can see how this occurs, particularly in like the black community in the United States. How if your father's not in the home and you're raised by your mother, and then you're like 12, 13, 14 trying to figure out how to be a man, and there's these gangster kids that are a few years older than you that are like, come hang out with us, do this, do that, become one of us. Like, you can see why they emulate that lifestyle, because that's how masculinity is being expressed around them.
Mm-hmm.
That's the kind of direct experience that they have. So you know that's basically, I think, why ultimately I rebelled, because it was like, well, uh, I could look up to like some intellectual, like intellectual type individual that I can find on the internet, or I can look up to um, some rock star. I look up to all these cultural figures basically to kind of compose my personality or compose my sense of who I should be, and it's ultimately like retarding, I think, on the
Mm-hmm.
individual. Like, so I think it has a lot to do with this, a lot to do with ultimately. I think in order for it to be reset, you need to have strong men that and, and obedient women ultimately, that ultimately have an embedded uh, understanding of how they're supposed to treat one another in traditional values, and ultimately like that an idea that they're given by God or by a spiritual force rather than simply negotiated like democratically. I think one of the great tragedies in the history of Anglo-Saxon civilization was the decapitation of Charles I, because this kind of moved the rationality of where does the king's authority come from a divine source to or divine right to parliamentary democracy. Um, and by the same token, another great tragedy was Henry VIII. You know, I know that historically it's far more complicated than this, but like the common popular understanding is that Henry VIII founded his own church and rejected the Pope's authority because he wanted to divorce his wife.
Mhm.
And he did divorce his wife. So ultimately, there is some truth to this popular trope, even though there's obviously a much larger political context around this decision. It wasn't just motivated by this, I don't think. But I think that's emblematic. This idea ultimately that, in the same way that the king divorces his wife, the church became divorced from Christ's authority, and there's this kind of like these kind of ruptures in Anglo-Saxon civilization that we never recovered from. That I think all these like subsequent events have just proliferated even more, further and further breakings apart, where we kind of increasingly democratize everything, meaning subordinating, whether it be gender roles or political authority or whatever, to a kind of imminent democratic process that doesn't have any kind of external method of valuation. That ultimately, I think the logic of democracy, if you glorify consent and democracy and these kinds of like liberal values, ultimately it's nihilistic, because you're saying that there is no set of standards, or there is no tradition, there is no way of life that is given to us from without, that it has
Mhm.
nothing to do with whether I agree with it or not.
Mhm.
Instead, everything is subordinated to our will and our capacity to form agreements based upon literally nothing but our own arbitration. Because if everything's subordinated to our agreement, that means our agreement is sovereign over everything. I think
Mhm.
this is a disastrous way of life, and it's not just in politics. It's like that's just one aspect. It's infected every aspect of the culture, I think.
Yeah. No, well said. And I think that was kind of Nietzsche's retort. And a lot of people think that, and I've said this before, that it was a kind of affirming thing when he said God is dead and we've killed him. You know, his blood is on our hands. He was warning. He was, saying we've effaced the metaphysical structures, the ground that we stand on. Right? We've effaced it. It's gone. We're not even aware of it yet. And his kind of solution to that was to kind of develop your own values, beyond good and evil. And we saw kind of how that led and what that led to, partly in the 20th century. It's like, where are you going to stand to build your own values from? And I think it just never was clear, with his will to power and kind of how that came into fruition. And then the 20th century, I got really into postmodernism, and I resonated with me the critiques of corruption and of power, like the Frankfurt School when it first kind of got off the ground. There was corruption in institutions across the board, religious institutions, the church, political institutions, corporate institutions, and there was this kind of vein of corruption that was being pointed to by the left. But and I was on the left, for most of my life until about 'I'd say 2015, and then I was like, oh, I started with what happened with Trump's election. But my idea was, the solutions to the problems of the left are not going to be found in the right. And I was always thinking there's got to be some sort of meta politics. There's got to be some sort of way to transcend this kind of left-right divide. And now I don't know. There are these two structures, right? There is the way the world lays itself out. You have the masculine and the feminine. You have the masculine drawing of boundaries and the building of hierarchies, and then you have the left or the feminine that structures the body, but also points to the corruption and kind of keeps this process going. So and I've heard you talk about a sort of a meta politics, and I was wondering, what do you think that could look like? Because I don't see the solutions coming from either the corporate or the political sphere. I think that there is something new emerging, and I think there's this kind of these networks being built through conversations through YouTube and other types of platforms. There's just new structures being built that will the kind of that's going to build the edifice for the solutions to emerge. So where do you see the solutions kind of going forward, and what space do you think they'll come from?
Yeah, well, I think I mean, for a time, I was kind of hoping that there could be a political solution, that maybe if we come up with the right analysis of economics and law and sociology, and we like propose this alternative set of disciplines that could like reorganize how the technocracy functions, and we could have a more like stable political order, and we could like fix the American empire, and you know, I think that's I think the ship has sailed on all of this. I think from a Christian perspective, ultimately we live in a civilization that has rebelled intensely against divinity, and basically rebelled against divinity that blessed it with incredible gifts. Like we were the greatest civilization in the history of mankind in terms of like prowess, power, just sheer square footage of domination. Um, and so, the providence that was received by, the kind of Anglo-American um, imperial project is beyond anything else achieved in human history. And what we've done is, totally um, rejected all of the values and that actually made this possible in the first place. And we're in rebellion, and ultimately, we deserve wrath, like we deserve judgment. And
Mhm.
I think ultimately, our empire is about to crumble. Maybe it already is. I mean, I think it's already dead. It's just like a zombie at this point. And I think it's going to fall apart, and I think it's going to be brutal. I think a lot of people are going to die. I think there's going to be a lot of wars. There's going to be these. I mean, I'm a bit of a conspiracy theorist. I think there is a kind of sociopathic, malevolent elite that are interested in crazy shit like population reduction on a radical scale, and like
Mhm.
mass automation, um, and a total just like complete sabotage of so many social institutions. I was reading an article I posted on Twitter a month or so back, from MIT Technology Review, which I recommend to anyone who wants to kind of keep up to date with like how like sci-fi movies are becoming a reality. Like very like it's one of those publications that kind of is on like has a pretty good full spectrum kind of set of reporting. And they were interviewing this Israeli uh, scientist who is growing rat fetuses inside artificial wombs. And he's basically lobbying the Israeli government for the right to do this with humans.
Mhm.
Um, and he's like, well, with the technologies here, we know how to do this. It'd be very easy. I'll just kill the baby at a certain point so it doesn't grow up or whatever, and we can do all this research. And
Mhm.
in fact, I think they were going to genetically modify the baby so that it dies after 12 weeks or something. Um, and then the dude was asked by the reporter, have you consulted a rabbi or any other like religious leaders about whether you think this is a good idea or not ethically? And he said, no, the Israeli Science Commission is my rabbi.
Mhm.
Um, and so, I mean, this is like shit straight out of like Brave New World. At some point, if they develop the capability to like grow their own people, you know, uh, it makes sense why they're trying to destroy the family. Why would you want to allow people to be raised in familial constructs if you're part of like the psychopathic elite? When you can grow your own people genetically modified to your own specific specification, um, and then raise them in like a kind of industrialized indoctrination environment into becoming like perfect technocratic slaves for the industrial system. And so I think we're about to like we're kind of radically approaching, like, as I said before, like we're living in like a real life sci-fi movie. Um, you know, I'm not really super like optimistic about a political solution. Ultimately, I think it has to be a spiritual solution. I think
Mhm.
ultimately we need to, because the problem of the West, it doesn't just go back to, I said before, like these key moments like Henry VIII, but But you can and Charles the First, but you could keep tracing it back much further than this. You know, you can trace it back at least to ancient Greece, if not further, all the way back to the inception of civilization, where, and I wrote about this in my paper, my first paper in my journal at firstness.org that I launched a couple months ago.
Mhm.
I kind of did this critique of Socrates, talking about how like Socrates is the arch sophist. He claims to be against sophistry, but he is the greatest sophist of them all, and he's a nihilist. I mean, I stole that critique basically from Nietzsche, but
Mhm.
um, that ultimately the attitude of the West from Socrates onwards is one of paranoia. We don't
Mhm.
trust. We can't take anything on faith. We don't trust any kind of givenness. When Socrates is told, well, it's good because the gods will it, he can't accept this. He has to ask why. He has to keep reasoning as though there's going to be some kind of abstract, definitional, set of propositions that he can like attain that's going to explain to him what the truth is. But ultimately, all that he does is create like language that refers to itself in this kind of recursive circularity that signifies nothing. It's this kind of, I described it as like a vortex, like a black hole um, that allows nihilism to kind of embed itself. And so we enter into this very paranoid mentality in the West, where we're constantly questioning every institution, every discourse. But then the very like act of questioning ultimately can be questioned itself. And that's why ultimately I think what postmodernism is like this recognition that um, that the entire project of Western metaphysics recurses back on itself and destroys itself. I mean, Heidegger announced this. Um, and so what's
Socrates was taking his counsel from daemons, right? He called them daemons, right? Which is where we get our modern term demons from, right? And that parlance was used in the Hebrew and during that time is not just a negative spiritual entity, but as any kind of spiritual entity. So, while he kind of disregarded the guards, he would talk about the relationship that he had with his daemon, where he would get his inspiration from. And kind of as an aside, you see a lot of in this new age kind of new age spirituality, there's a lot of channeling going on where people kind of leave their consciousness, leave their bodies, and they channel information from different beings from other planets or whatever it may be. I think it's just a return of the same mythological ethos that's just couched in new different language that we're seeing here. But I didn't mean to cut you off. It's that history though of that at that time of what the gods were and what a spiritual being or a spiritual entity was is very interesting. And I think it's been our understanding has been misguided in terms of the relationship between the gods at different levels and the human beings at that time. And then if you have the idea of powers and principalities in Christianity, right? You have these kind of higher level forces that interact with humans and kind of guide them in different ways. And you could see this process of questioning and disintegration that I think you're right that Socrates did sort of inaugurate. But he did have relations with non-physical beings, which is something that's like it's interesting, But go ahead. I'm sorry.
No, that's okay. Yeah, I mean, obviously, like Plato is a mystic of sorts, but it's more like what's implied by the method, like the methodological attitude. Because, I mean, my view is that attitude, like any kind of model of the world, presupposes the attitude of its modeler. Um, and in other words, like ultimately, aesthetics precedes representation. Um, and this is like a Deleuzian point that ultimately um, our sense of things must occur in an event which is a pure effect that has no cause, because the only other way of like of kind of conceptualizing the world in terms of these like causal relations, where we constantly kind of, well, this because this because this because this kind of framework of analyzing being ultimately presupposes itself, like what causes causality, or like you get into all these like antinomian, like in Kant's Antinomies of Pure Reason, you get into all these antinomian paradoxes where like, you can't really imagine a first cause without violating causality. You have the problem of infinitesimals, like the very method you use to kind of divide up an object into constituent parts can be used upon those constituent parts ad infinitum. And so there is this kind of this kind of infinite divisibility available in abstraction, that makes it impossible to kind of stop it at any one point. And so, but nevertheless, like it's kind of like Zeno's paradox, like that Bergson loves referencing, this idea. Well, if you keep dividing like a distance by half, eventually there'll be an infinite amount of like divisions, because you can keep dividing things by half infinitely, and so that means nothing can ever traverse this distance because it's an infinite amount of distance. Like it would be but obviously that's ridiculous. Obviously things move. And so what this really is a critique of abstraction. And it's like, well, at some point you just have to affirm something. And so, but the kind of act of affirmation doesn't happen in a vacuum. You can't arbitrate it. Ultimately, we exist in as Heidegger described, a thrownness. And this is kind of what inspired me to return to Christianity, because I mean, for a time I was trying to embrace paganism. I had a period when I was into like Zen Buddhism, and a period of being into occultism. But at this point, I was trying to embrace paganism. I said, I've got to kind of embrace the religion of my ancestors. And there's something very, I mean, you're a Greek guy, so maybe you don't feel this in the same way, but like I feel a deep resonance with like Norse mythology or whatever. Like it feels, you probably might feel the same about like Greek mythology. But ultimately, what I realized was, well, at the end of the day, like my ancestors, because these are ancestral cults. Like my ancestors have passed Christianity down to me, not Norse paganism. Yet my distant ancestors must have been like Norse pagans or whatever. But it's broken. The chain's broken. I can't actually receive the traditions from them, but I can receive Christianity directly from. My grandparents went to church, my parents went to church, whatever their problematic relationship with the church was. There's all these institutions around me, all these Christians that I know personally. I can receive the tradition directly. I was raised in it. It was like given to me, and so who am I to deny this?
Yeah.
And so I started kind of changing my mentality, I guess, trying to change and embrace this attitude of just affirming what is given, as opposed to trying to get out behind everything and constantly question everything. And I think this is the kind of, not that I've achieved it or like completely, but this is the spiritual attitude that's required, of like just intense faithfulness. I think insofar as we're locked into this, well, I think basically what we're doing right now is we're building a prison of our own rationality around ourselves, where these deterministic structures of rationalization kind of becoming embodied in the cybernetic structure of robotics and computing, and ultimately the technocracy itself, the bureaucracy itself. I've been using this word techno-bureaucracy lately to kind of fuse those two terms together. The logic that guides all of these processes is just these elaborate rationalizations that we then like subordinate ourselves to. And we're getting to the point where we're kind of pulling apart the human. We're pulling apart our own capacity for freedom inside this superstructure that's like really embodied in technological apparatuses. And eventually we're just going to, like, I think it's almost as though God doesn't need to send us to hell, because we're literally building a hell around ourselves as we speak, as the logical conclusion of our rebellion against being faithful.
Yeah, so that's interesting, because I had a very similar realization a few years ago, and I was I got into philosophy. It's at university, but I was political theory, philosophy, and then after I graduated, I really got into philosophy. Heidegger, the German idealist, and then the French postmodernists. I really got into Deleuze, and then the psychoanalysts, a little bit of Lacan, but I never really bought into the logic of it. Always seemed like a little bit.
I feel like you need to know Lacan to understand Deleuze's work in many ways, though, obviously.
Yeah, I was more on the kind of Guattari side of the critique a little bit, because he kind of fell away from Lacan, and then I think he influenced Deleuze a lot in kind of their collaboration. But when my parents moved here from Greece, and I went to church with my grandma and grandpa, they both didn't speak any English when I was young, and so I had the same idea, the same realization, that there was just a huge tradition of the Greek Orthodox tradition that all of my ancestors were part of. And I was literally the first generation to cut that off. People would ask me, "Are you so you're Greek Orthodox?" I would say yes, culturally, but I got really heavily into Buddhism through integral theory, Ken Wilber, and then I got really into Buddhism, but then I got really into Taoism. I started practicing Qigong for many years. I was teaching meditation, and I was lucid dreaming, psychedelics, everything you can kind of think of in terms of this new age spirituality, crystals, all this stuff. And it almost dissolved my marriage. It almost disintegrated my marriage. I thought that I was going to travel the world healing people, doing hands-on healing, Reiki, and practicing people and teaching people how to heal themselves. I was just a facilitator, I would think, right? And there are these, especially in traditional Chinese medicine, and they work. I don't practice them anymore because they work, right? You can develop and cultivate, qi, which is essentially spiritual energy of well-being. The Chinese have, we have this idea in the West of being healthy or sick, right? The Chinese just have many, many levels above healthy, where you can cultivate life force energy, you can cultivate well-being and share that with others. And that's kind of what Qigong is in Neigong, which is the cultivation of Qi, which is kind of correlated with the Holy Spirit in a sense. And I think there's a lot of correlations with Taoism. I think Taoism is the closest to the Logos before the Logos became man, before Christ became man, right? And I think that there are seeds of the Logos that manifested itself in disparate cultures and different times throughout the world, right? So the Norse, the Hebrews, the Native Americans, the Hindus, the Buddhists, like all around, it's in this kind of realization that these religions are not wrong, right? They're not wrong, they're incomplete, right? Because the whole idea I would have before is like, how could you say that Christianity is the one true religion? What about all these other religions? If you happen to be born in a different place, you'd have a different religion. And it's like, well, they weren't wrong, right? The Logos manifests itself in philosophy and in many different ways. But then starting to grasp with the idea that the Logos, that God became man, and really start to look at that and really start to act that out. I used to give Jordan Peterson, I'd say he's copping out when people would ask him, do you believe in God? He would say, I act as if God exists. And I'd be like, man, that's a cop out, but it's not. It's powerful, right? If you act as if God exists, right? If you follow the commandments, right? If you follow Christ's teachings in his life, not participate or believe in some kind of superficial way, your life will change, like your relationships. And that's the biggest thing. Like when I got back into my Orthodox roots through the church fathers, through the work of Jonathan Peugeot, like I really started reading the church fathers, and I found, especially in the Hesychast tradition, just the most beautifully distilled, potent spiritual information that the Buddhists, the Zen monks were meditating on. Like they have so much there, and it's just in its purest form. And I was never made aware of it before. And I'm like, how did I not know about this? And then I kind of dug into it. And since that, my life has changed dramatically. Not that I am getting stuff, material things. It's just that the relationship started healing with my family, my wife, my kids. I just became different, like a more present father. Like I really got interested in being a great man for my kids and for my wife. And this idea of the woman is supposed to submit to her husband, like I would think that's such bullshit. No wonder I was kind of a feminist, right? Because like, what is this submission stuff? It's like, well, there's this reciprocal relationship there. The man is to sacrifice himself for his wife and his family, and the woman is to submit, right? And it's this whole fractal pattern of how reality lays itself out. And when I started looking at the Bible through new eyes, right, through after going through all of this philosophical training and kind of other metaphysical type training, a lot of things clicked for me in understanding of the Logos and how the Logos lays itself out in personally and then collectively, right? So this is fractal pattern of unfolding of how hierarchies work. And I was of the postmodern mind, that not totally, but hierarchies in themselves are bad or evil or corrupt. And the idea is that hierarchies are just how the world works, right? Your body is a hierarchy. You have a head, right? The head informs the body. You literally inform the body by eating food, right? And the body supports the head. And there's a way to understand that. And it scales at every level, from the individual to the familial, to the national, to the global, in a sense, is that there is a way to build structures that are coherent, that distribute well-being. But, you have to, first we have to understand that, all right, there is a God, right? Well, let's talk about that. There is a God, is unknowable, right? He's a mystery, he's infinite, right? If you plug into him, like Christ's 2 commandments, love God with all your heart, right? And love your neighbor as yourself. You can't do the second part without the first part, right? You have to plug into the mystery, into the infinite. And then we were talking before about the 10 commandments, and the 10 commandments are like the source code of building civilization, right? If you follow the infinite mystery, right, and you plug in, you will develop a reciprocal relationship that will purify your heart, that will change your personality, and that will have ripples effects through your local environment. Again, and it happens through the relationships between those closest to you, and that ripples out, right? And then the commandments, right? Don't lie, don't cheat, don't steal, don't covet your neighbor's things. These aren't archaic, superstitious rules. These are base codes that if you follow them, you can create beautiful, wonderful, bespoke realities that are unfathomable to us right now. But you have to get this kind of base level. And then just to speculate a little bit, it's like, you can build intergalactic traveling civilization if you just get this, if you can encode trust and love in community, right? And how can you do that? You can't do that through bureaucracies. You can't do that through kind of materialist metaphysics or dialectical materialism. You just can't. It just doesn't work, right? There is a way to do it, and that's kind of where I'm grappling at right now in this understanding of what Christ is. Christ is the appropriate mediation, the appropriate relationship between multiplicity and unity, right? And it scales at every level. So kind of with that background, you said that you've recently got into Christianity. Can you take me a little bit into what that felt like and what that's looked like the last few months for you?
Yeah, so I went through this process of engaging in like intense philosophical study. And my view is that Deleuze is like the final boss of Western metaphysics. Like trying to understand difference and repetition, you basically have to read almost all of the Western philosophical tradition to be able to appreciate it. And as you understand more of the tradition, you realize, because he doesn't explain where all these references are coming from, you start seeing these terms and now you realize they exist. This is a reference to Spinoza I didn't even realize, or this is a reference to Leibniz or whatever I didn't realize, or different theologians, through the theological tradition and so forth. And so as I was going through this process, as well, I'm also trying to work on this this other thing, which is the political project, centered around the work of Adam Katz, and which he builds out of kind of synthesis of generative anthropology and neo-reactionary political philosophy. Which is trying to think in a post-liberal way. Like, how do we think about things in terms of how do we get rid of all these liberal abstractions and like break down how society actually works? Like, as you were saying before, like, hierarchy is everywhere, and this is actually true. You see this in Deleuze's philosophy as well, because where he has to go in order to abolish all hierarchies from thinking is this kind of like basically the entirely the schizification of the subject. Which is grotesque, really, in my view. The only way to kind of get away from these hierarchies is to kind of dissolve yourself. And so, like the individual, which the liberal holds up, is it assumes like if the only reason that like capitalism worked so well at the beginning was because it hadn't won yet. There was still a monarchy. There was still everyone was still Christian. Everyone still had all of these traditional values and family structures and so forth. As all these things became liquidated, now it's becoming incredibly incoherent, and the whole economy is just financialization. The government has to be the driving force behind all innovation and has to kind of maintain like the entire direction of innovation. Private corporations are incapable of doing this. And so like I think this is the direction. Like the individual in and of itself is just vapid. It's just form without content. The content has to be supplied by some kind of like prior act of faith, act of communion that ultimately is then interpreted and then expressed in setting up a set of disciplines and practices that bring intelligibility to the society. Because ultimately, what politics is about is epistemology. It's ultimately about intelligibility. Political authorities have the right to intervene and review what you're doing. So if someone has the right to kind of formally go through, what are you doing? Is this correct? Is this incorrect? They can't just do this based on however they feel that day. They ultimately need to have intelligibility for what they're doing, because if they make all these arbitrary decisions, they're going to undermine their own authority. So um, this is why we have this, laws, this massive formal system, bureaucracy, have all these formal systems and policies, and like everything's laid on top of each other, because you need to have intelligibility to run an organization. Like otherwise, no one knows what the fuck they're supposed to be doing. So the way in which you learn anything is through subordinating yourself to an authority who teaches you how to do it, or just like literally names practices that you're engaging in. And so I was working on this problem, and I'm reading Deleuze. I'm trying to kind of complete Western philosophy and take these ideas and synthesize them. And I'm reading Logic of Sense, and in Logic of Sense, Deleuze describes what he calls the ion. He names it the ion in Difference and Repetition as well, obviously after the Greek deity. And he gives the ion all of these theological characteristics. It's impassible. It has aseity. It's formless but infinite. It is the source of all creation, and yet it has no cause. Basically he's describing God, and he says every single event of intelligibility requires the ion. Otherwise, every sense event has to be this pure effect without cause. And so I'm reading this, and I'm just getting taken aback by like the meaning of it, and I'm engaging in this practice of trying to understand authority, and I'm finding a circularity, because I've been trained particularly by Deleuze, but every great philosopher, in my opinion, to find circular logics, because that's how philosophy works. It exposes a circular logic, usually replaces it with some other circular logic that someone else discovers later down the track.
Yeah.
But that's basically what happens. We realize that all these signs are pointing to themselves, and we have to kind of come up with new signs. And so I find a circular logic trying to solve the problem I was trying to deal with in jurisprudence, which is I was critiquing the notion of rule of law. Obviously, law can't interpret itself. Like abstractions need to be decided upon by an active interpretation. There is like kind of the Schmittian point, I guess, as a critique of like formalist jurisprudence. But then obviously we have this problem where you have like the Supreme Court like reinterpreting the Constitution to say that abortion is legal or something, when obviously like that's not, like this is just a total farce. So you can't just, if you just have like total arbitration, what is that based on? Well, the people that interpret the Constitution to say that abortion is legal, there's some other prior discourse that tells them that that's a good idea. If it's not the Constitution itself, which they're kind of misinterpreting, you could say, something else is telling them that it's a good idea. If you're a Supreme Court justice, you probably went to Harvard. You're probably embedded in all these secret societies and institutions, or you rub shoulders with different elites, and they have discourses that make intelligible what their standards are supposed to be, so they can signal to each other, yes, I'm one of you, and then they all pick each other to be in all these different formal roles. And so who constructed that discourse? Ultimately, someone had to decide upon that discourse. And then it's the same problem. On what basis did they decide upon that? They would have to have some prior discourse that made that intelligible to them, and so forth. And so there's this circle where like there's individuals making decisions, but those decisions are constructed by practices which are hierarchically mediated, ultimately by individuals, and they just keep flowing back into each other. And so there's no, if you try to imagine it on a practical level and you try to set it up temporally, there's no omega point that you can imagine where we can create our own intelligibility, where we can create our own values. Instead, it must be given. There must be some revelatory event in which it's just bestowed upon us. And so like when I kind of had this realization, I just had the sense that I need to, like as I said before, who am I to reject Christianity? Like I'm, I'm rejecting it on the basis of a set of intellectual misgivings. I mean, you were talking about all these like really fanciful reasons for why Christianity is great, and they're nice to listen to. But ultimately, like, I kind of just want to be a normal guy. I just want to be able to just like have a normal life and know what I'm doing. I don't want everything to be confusing. I don't want to have some elaborate theory about why it should be this way or that way. I just want it to be given to me, to be honest, so I can just know what's right and wrong. I've been attracted, actually. I mean, I've been in the process of converting to Catholicism, but I've been attracted actually to like fundamentalist Baptist preaching lately, because I love how they're just like, everything is just like the King James Bible says this, so this is what we believe, and they're just like autistic about it. To me, there's something like really beautiful about this. And previously I would have hated fundamentalism, like, oh, it's intellectually backwards, it's dogmatic. But I came to the realization that everything's fucking dogmatic. There is no non-dogmatic way. I mean, if you look at like Deleuze, it's like the anti-dogmatic philosopher par excellence. Ultimately, there is all of these like subtle presuppositions, like you said, like this negative valuation of hierarchy. There's all of these like implicit ideas that we should strive toward this, we should strive toward that. um, uh, I'm just not. I mean, I just don't have a desire to engage in this kind of nihilistic excess where we just keep questioning everything constantly. I just want something to decide upon something. I want authority to be like, this is what you should do. I want intelligibility. I want order. So yeah, I'm just like, well, if I lived my life entirely based upon all of these Christian principles, that would make sense. Like the principles make sense. People have lived like this for thousands of years. It obviously works. And if I just tell everyone around me to live in this way, then I have an ability to speak. I know what I'm supposed to tell people to do. I know how to tell my wife what to do. I know how to tell my friends what to do. I know how to tell people what to do, and then everything can kind of start to make sense if I become this locus of intelligibility. Because where else, like in Western civilization, like who do you push? How do you push Jesus Christ out of the way to affirm who? Like who can you place in our civilization above Jesus Christ as a moral authority? I mean,
Satan.
well, I guess, but you can't really. There is no like good argument that I can see. Like there's no like rival figure. I kind of counterpose Socrates with Jesus Christ. I think this is a good distinction to make. But there's no rival figure that really occupies the same position of relevance. And so it's like, well, like I'm not the person who is going to decide on how Western civilization should be organized based upon my internal mental processes. So I need to follow somebody else's determination. This is the guy with the most successful interpretation so far. So I'm just going to affirm what he says, because ultimately, I mean, this is kind of my attitude towards monarchism, where I was led towards monarchism in the abstract sense, which is just that, like, well, someone has to fucking be in charge, otherwise nothing makes sense. We're just constantly asking questions about who should be in charge in this impossible to answer manner. I think this is what liberalism ultimately is. It's just like recursive usurpation of authority. And so, well, at some point we just have to say, that guy's in charge, tell me what to do. And I'm going to start reading everything that I do into his authority.
Well, it's show me what to do. Like you said, you can now tell people from a place of authority you feel comfortable, but it's show me what you show them, right? It's not an intellectual exercise. And I'm just speaking, I'm not saying this is the way it is. It's not an intellectual exercise, because, in Orthodoxy, you have the passions, right? You think of the passions are things that that act through you. And that passions a lot of times are good things that when they get pushed on, they become addictions or whatever it may be. And I think we have similar passions in terms of intellectual. The Greeks have this term called logismo, which is this constant calculation of trying to kind of figure things out intellectually. But the answers are are kind of in the heart, right? And they have a lot to do with love and truth together. And there's ideas we're looking for answers, but we're looking at truth completely. The scientific notion of truth is not wrong, right? It's very valuable in this relativistic way to build and innovate. But I think Heidegger was kind of getting to it. But truth is a person, right? And this is something that, to think that God is some kind of energetic force, like the force or chi or the Tao, whatever it may be. Like the truth is a person. Christ is the truth. And I'm wrestling with that. It's like, what does that mean? Right? The truth is you have a hypothesis, you have an experiment, and if the results match your hypothesis, that's a truth event, right? Well, no, truth is a person, truth is Christ. Okay. What does that mean? Well, follow his life, right? Follow his teachings. The two main commandments is like, listen, love God with all your heart and love your neighbor as yourself, right? And something that's changed my life dramatically is prayer, and not just my own prayer. I started just stopped relying on myself, right? And I said, you would disregard the saints, or I wouldn't even think of, why would I look at the saints? Why would I look at the church fathers, right? And I said, let me just follow this and see, right? And I'm always mindful, like, how do I know I'm not trapped in another ideology? How do I know that 5 years from now, I'm not going to be like, oh, I was a Jesus freak 5 years from now, and there's something else that I'm on to, right? So I ask myself that, and there's something different in terms of the quality. And I go back to the relationships, right? And things, the hierarchy in the self and then around me just starts sorting itself out and laying itself out appropriately. And it's like, the way that, and it's prayer has been a big thing for me. So I got an Orthodox prayer book. It was a Orthodox prayer for young people, right? And it was like it was a little book, and it had prayers from the saints in there. And then I built up from that into taking some other prayers from the saints. And I started praying every day, every morning and every night with my 6-year-old son. And he's super into it. He'll remind me to pray. Hey, don't forget that. And I'll pray literally 3 times a day. And you literally develop a relationship with Christ. Like, to hear me say that, like 5 years ago or 10 years ago, to hear me saying that now, I'd be like, oh my God, what have you done? Like, what's gotten into you? But like, that's the answer in a sense, right? And you've been hitting on it, right? Faith. What is faith? Like, what is that? Does that mean believing in stuff that with no evidence? It's like, that's what I've thought my entire life. But Marshall McLuhan, and it was Marshall McLuhan, Rene Girard, people like that who were way smarter than me, had more intellectual power than I did, and especially Girard, who went through the whole postmodern ethos, and then at the end said, "Oh, look, I found it in Christ. I found it in Christianity." Same thing with Marshall McLuhan. The dude is unbelievably well read in literature and philosophy, and he was a devout Catholic. He would read the Bible, and he knew 10, 11 different languages, and he would read the Bible everywhere he would travel. He would ask from the hotel to take the Bible, and he would read it in different languages in a sense, right? So it's like, I saw these people take Christianity seriously, right?
Did you respect Carl Jung?
Yeah, I did before a lot, right? And
I mean, I respect him in the sense that I think he's probably the greatest psychologist I've ever heard of, that I've ever been aware of, in terms of, because I went through a period of getting into psychology and actually studied psychology at university at one point. And if you I only found out about this recently. If you went to Carl Jung for like therapy, and he found out you're a Catholic, he would refuse to give you therapy, and he had a list in his drawer of priests in the area, and he would send you to one.
Oh wow!
And I thought, wow, he's probably the greatest, one of, if not maybe the greatest psychotherapist ever. And even he's like, I can't help you, man. You need to go there. Like,
yeah.
So
it's like, if you can, and I think there's a big, on the internet, this divide between Orthodoxy and Catholicism and Protestantism, and there's always these fighting and this, like, bickering and whatnot. And I'm like, I appreciate a Protestant that really believes in his faith and treats people well and really believes and lives a life in Christ, rather than some Orthodox person that is arguing or going through the motions. And I think that's this kind of similar vein of Carl Jung, right? So, like, if you have a priest, if you have something that will bring you towards Christ, bring you to the actual transcendent, to bring you towards God, that can take many flavors, but it also can take many turns, right? You can be an Orthodox, and you can make Orthodoxy or Catholicism, you can make that an ideology, right? And I think the main distinction is there. You have to make it, you have to plug in. I don't know what that looks like or how to do that. With me, it's not that I'm there, right? It's through prayer, and kind of worship and trusting. But prayer is the biggest thing. And Marshall McLuhan said that faith is a mode of perception. It's a mode of perception we have to cultivate ourselves into, right? And then miracles exist, but we're not entrained into kind of this broader world that's around us, right, to observe them, right? So actually having faith and this whole metaphysical construct that the postmodernists and Deleuze brought, it's like they got it 50% wrong, right? I actually commented on one of your Deleuze videos. I'm like, Deleuze just folded the transcendent into his materialist metaphysics through different ideas of the virtual and his transcendental idealism. It's like he was talking about the transcendent, but maybe he couldn't say it then, or he didn't want to say it, or he wouldn't allow himself. But I think Deleuze, in a strange way, and I had that same idea. I slayed the guy at the end of the game reading Deleuze, because you have to have Aristotle, Spinoza, Bergson, right? And he was probably played an integral role in me finding Christ, which is a strange thing. And hearing your kind of story of going through him, and then the same questions that you were asking yourself, I was asking myself. And I still appreciate that there's something about reading Deleuze that you feel like it gets you high a little bit, right? It makes you feel
well, he's he's a genius at the end
yeah.
of the day. Like he's a incredible genius, because you get in his like professional career, you have this like I think he gets his PhD in like 1948 or something,
Mm-hmm.
and then he writes a book on Hume in the early 50s, which is quite short, and he writes a book on Kant in the early 60s, which is also quite short, but he doesn't really do much for almost 20 years, and then all of a sudden it's like these like huge books start coming out. He must have just been reading everything for like 15, 20 years.
And his older books are very straightforward. They're very well written, concise.
When he writes a book on another philosopher, yeah, so concise. And then people have this idea, well, he's really, he's got word salad and he's like making things harder to understand than necessary. You only think that if you don't know the history of philosophy. When you start to learn the history of philosophy and you read Difference of Repetition, every single word like refers to like all these other different thinkers in ways you don't even realize. It's like a cultism in a way. There's just like stuff there that you can't see unless you have the eyes to see it. And so yeah, he is really masterful. So you have to respect in terms of just like as a genius. And there's many ideas that he has that I think are brilliant. One idea that I stole from him, because he has this you talked about the virtual, he has this like the ideas are like imminent potentials, because obviously like in Deleuze's metaphysics, there's like a primordial chaos, which is just pure intensity, and then it develops resonances with itself in like what he calls like fields of individuation, which he takes from Simondon, where resonances within this intensive flux produce basically ideal types. That there are like ideal kind of forms that will be able to kind of represent these resonances, and so those resonances will then form like the kind of most fundamental structures in like extensive being. And so the ideas themselves are totally virtual in the sense that they don't exist anywhere, but they are like the pattern, they are the formal, like these resonances will tend to kind of continue in like with a similar fashion. It's like a problem, like chaos poses a problem that these ideas perpetually solve. And so they're more like themes that then become dramatized in these individual events of like emergence. And so this idea of thematization and dramatization, in the paper that I wrote in the first issue of my journal, I contrasted dramatization with rationalization. This idea that we're constantly trying to, because I was kind of there's like you look at like Jonathan Haidt's research on like moral intuitionism, and I was reading, I can't remember the dude's name, like some Polish psychologist who invented ponerology, which is like the study of evil and psychopathy. And he was like writing at the time when the communists were taken over from the Nazis. And he was writing about how the tendency of psychopaths to take over the government as a kind of like sociological theory. And this term rationalization kept popping up in these different things I was reading. And so I just realized this is a dichotomy, rationalization and dramatization. Like Jesus doesn't like speak very explicitly quite often. He always speaks in parables, and he kind of acts out more so than says what one should do. He's not, like Jesus didn't write a book, you know what I mean? He lived a life and he developed disciples. And so you think about it, like if you watch a movie, like the themes in a movie don't have to be explicitly outlined in any specific part of the movie. Instead, you watch the whole thing, and then the theme is like everywhere. It's nowhere specifically, but it's everywhere in that cinematic experience or whatever. And so this kind of like theme, or this kind of thinking in terms of themes rather than in terms of like static identities, and thinking in terms of drama instead of like rational processes. This is very inspirational to me, because this seems to be this distinction between Socrates and Christ that I was playing with, where in order to emulate Christ, it's about practice. It's not about theory.
Mm-hmm.
You can be like a theological master, but you be a terrible Christian if you don't practice. Like, you have to
Mm-hmm.
live like Christ, um, and you're supposed to embody it dramatically. So when Deleuze gives the example of learning to swim, how like you can't read a book on how to swim and then just go swim. You'd have to like
Mm-hmm.
go out into the waves and like crash around and make mistakes. Another way you can learn how to swim is watching someone else swim and kind of like copying what they do. In fact, mimetics, you mentioned Gerard, like mimesis is like the omega point of cognition in many ways.
Mm-hmm.
Um, you pretty much everything, like every word that we use that we didn't like invent ourselves is an imitation of how other people use that word. That's how we understand its meaning. There's all these different contexts that we like, these iterated contexts where these words were used, and we develop a kind of sense of like where they're appropriate to be spoken. And so like everything is kind of built out of mimesis in a certain way. And so um, Christ offers this kind of capacity to imitate him, which is
Mm-hmm.
different than just rationally understand him. So I'm also frustrated. Like I want to become a Catholic, but I'm like, can I be a Catholic without being a Thomist or a fucking? Do I have to? I mean, I'll read the books, but like, do I have to be like some autistic dogmatist, or can I just like go to mass and like pray and like go to confession and just live a Catholic life or a Christian life? That's all I really want to do. I don't really care about intellect. Like, I'm an intellectual person. I don't want to intellectualize anything. I just want to.
Mm-hmm.
I'm sick of intellectualizing. I just want to live. In a,
Yeah.
in a in a particular way. So that's kind of what the kind of direction I want to head with this.
Marshall McLuhan said that, he had his popular saying, the medium is the message, or the medium and the message, right? He said that Christ is where the medium and the message are one, right? And it's this idea of and Deleuze talks about human beings invest their desire, and his whole presupposition was to invest it in creative novelties that create lines of flight into new territories that express the human creativity. It's like, okay, that's your fundamentalism there. Like, you think novelty is in itself good, like, creation and novelty is in itself good for itself. But the fathers talk about true freedom, right, is to desire God, right, is to desire Christ, right? Because Girard talks about, the desire is always the desire of the other, right? And we're always building mimetic rivalries with others, and this is kind of the function of advertising and the function of relationship as such. But the whole thing is, imitate Christ, and he short circuits that process that builds up to eventually it leads to violence, right? And in short circuits, he kind of the scapegoat mechanism of the scapegoat being innocent short circuited this scapegoating process that throughout history would return a sense of normalcy to the civilization, right? They would discharge their sin on the scapegoat, and in that process, for a short period of time, that would normalize the civilization, and there would be some coherence there for a while. There's this idea that religion and worship, and these are structures of reality. If you cannot get rid of them, when you get rid of them, they come back in truly monstrous ways. And so we're seeing the scapegoat mechanism continuously firing and trying to find new populations or people or ideas to scapegoat. And it was Trump for a while. Now with Trump gone, it's his supporters, and then it's white supremacy, and it's white people as such. And it's like it's bananas. You see very well-meaning, rational people talking about that white supremacy is this kind of insidious force that's the problem for all of the ills of society. And it's like, white
It's not even
supremacy,
white supremacy. It's just whiteness.
yeah, and which is not even a real thing. Like what do you mean?
Well, I
Like
think
here,
whiteness is a real thing, but I think it's
what?
good.
But what do you mean? What in what sense though? Like I'm I'm Greek, right? If my is it skin tone, right? Is there a certain melanin level that decides?
No, I mean, like the
Yeah.
critical theorists, the way they describe whiteness, it has all these good characteristics. So it's like showing up on time to things.
Mm-hmm.
Um, the belief that like the wife should stay home and the man should go to work. Like they just
Yeah.
load it with all of these concepts that are like really nice. Just like
Yeah.
basically how, you know, Protestant civilization functions.
Yeah. And they're,
Like, you
yeah.
know, uh, or what, or even just Christian civilization, basically, Christendom or
Yeah.
whatever. Uh,
Yeah.
but uh, but yeah, but that's, I mean, that's really, like, scapegoating is inevitable insofar as it's a really good technology as well. Like if you're political operative, so you can be. It's like two ways of rationalizing mass democracy. There's a Greek philosopher, Condylus, that I just started reading, contemporary. Like I think he died in the late '90s or something. And I've been reading his book, The Political and Man, which is a elaborate critique of sociology. And he talks about these like two phases where you have what he calls oligarchic liberalism and mass democracy. He says that 20th century, 19th to 20th century, the move was from oligarchic liberalism to mass democracy. Because, you know, original liberalism, like liberalism of Thomas Jefferson, you know, you could still enslave black people and you could only vote if you owned property, and like the idea that women could vote would just be laughable, you know.
Mm-hmm.
So it was a completely different approach, where mass democracy comes along and you get like propaganda, industrialized media, all these other different factors that come in. Um, Progressivism, where you get the kind of bureaucracy taking center stage of the government. Um, and so an entirely new phase of governance kind of emerges. And with mass democracy, it has this. He, Condylus describes how what's if you try to like turn mass democratic ideology into a science, the natural tendency would be to kind of have this kind of infusion of cybernetics with sociology, which is exactly what we see
Mm-hmm.
after World War II. Because the like for mass democracy to make sense, Condylus points out that the individual can't have any substance. They must be a pure function,
Mm-hmm.
because if the individual has any substantive qualities, then how can you say that they have like equal discretionary members of a democracy? So like if if my substance as a white male or something, or as a Christian or as a whatever, predisposes me to having certain values, this is an obstacle to mass democratic logic, which is that values are emergent from the immanent relations between within the social field.
Mm-hmm.
And so the social field must become reified, and then everything must be subordinated to like functions that make it up. And so it's similar to like actually Deleuze's an aspect of Deleuze's philosophy as well, where like he thinks in terms of pure relations. There are no like pre-established identities, and so you get this liquefaction of all substantive qualities, and instead we are just pure function. So I can just put on a dress and put on lipstick and say I'm a woman, and I'm a woman now because I'm a pure function. I have no substance as a man. I have no substance as anything. And so the scapegoat then becomes the obstacle to the pure like emptying out and turning vapid, uh, um, and turning totally fungible, interchangeable, and like, I can take a Somali refugee and plug them into Western society and teach them JavaScript and they can become a millionaire or something. Like that's not going to happen.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but we have to affirm this, because otherwise you're a racist, white supremacist, sexist, or whatever. If you say that there's any substantive differences between anyone, and so this pure functionalization, what this does is it instrumentalizes everyone, but it also
Mm-hmm.
turns us into these forms without content, these totally interchangeable units that mean nothing and are nothing. That can be totally overcoded by a technocratic manipulation in order to optimize, like the kind of social engineers mentality, optimizing the system. How does he know how to optimize it? Well, it's this
Mm-hmm.
just he optimizes by making it more what he already thinks it is. It's just
Yeah.
this kind of like these signs pointing back to themselves. It's like really like disgusting in a way. Um, and so I think this really does sum up the condition, the modern condition in many ways. That like in order, like that's why we have scapegoating, because you could be like a postmodernist and be like everything's bullshit, man, and just like be like Derridian or something and critique everything, but that's not very actionable. Like you're not gonna overthrow the political system as a post-structuralist. So
Mhm.
like if you have to put it into action, you need to have, like I said before, politics is about epistemology. How can a bureaucracy administer this? How can they administer this kind of relativistic logic? The only way they can administer it is by setting up a victim, like an emissary victim, that is, well, we could all be like these pure functional democratic agents that could be and choose anything. But the obstacle are these white men and their substantive difference that they assert on us with all of their like hegemonic European standards. And so if we just like persecute them and move them out of all these positions of authority over their own civilization, then eventually we'll become liberated to be like these pure fungible functional units. And then, you know, then it's like liberation theology with in a very like convoluted way.
Yeah.
um and so I think this is like ultimately what it comes down to, is that like yeah, there is this drive to scapegoating that Gerard noted, but it's also about just like the practicality of how do you put this shit into practice, because um you know, you need a kind of an actionable process.
Mhm.
And removing whiteness, it's like this, you can just keep it kind of reminds me in fact of Zizek's Sublime Object of Ideology, where he
Mhm.
talks about how communism or democracy are like impossible concepts to realize, and so you can keep like your desire can keep loading into them. It's kind of like if you have a fantasy, you're in high school and there's this hot girl in your class and you really want to date her. Um, and then you do date her finally. She asks her out, she says yes, and then you get into a relationship. Eventually, you know, she starts getting pissed off because you're spending too much time with your friends, and like, you know, you see her in the morning without makeup when she just woke up, and like, you know, you see her when she's on her period and you have to deal with all of her like needs and emotions, and so like this perfect image you had of what she would be like kind of gets like pulled apart by the reality of actually being with her. And so then maybe you start thinking some other girl at school, you actually would rather date her or something because she can be this ideal image. So you look at like these weirdos that like jack off to like hentai, that jack off to like anime characters having sex or whatever. You can kind of see in a perverse way what they get out of it, which is that it's pure fantasy. It never actually has to. I mean, even pornography is like this in general. It never actually has to come into reality where you have to deal with the other person and like this, what that's actually like. You don't have to like rupture the ideal. You can keep loading your desire into this object that you're pursuing and never actually get. And this is what communism and democracy are. You can never get enough democracy, never get enough communism. It's never real communism. It's never real democracy. And we can just keep going on and on and on forever.
Mhm.
And all you have to do is just keep putting things in the way. Like if we just smash Trump, if we smash whiteness, if we smash all these different things out the way, then eventually we'll get there. And you can, and the masters of the system can just keep placing like new targets that are strategically expedient in the way of this like just perpetual process.
Yeah,
Um,
it's the small object A, right? Is this object cause of desire? So if you invest your desire in anything other than Christ, anything other than Christ, it becomes an idol, and you worship that idol until you destroy it. And then in its destruction, you're automatically investing your desire into another thing that will necessarily destroy, will be destroyed and will destroy you. And there's just constant process, this constant process of going back to the tree of the knowledge of good and evil and eating from it and eating from it. And we keep going back to eating from it, eating from it. When we don't have the spiritual capacity, the spiritual maturity, we're not communing with God, right? And when we keep eating from the knowledge of good and evil and trying to interpret reality from that sense, it will constantly lead to destruction. And I couldn't agree more. We're seeing a process of disincarnation. We're not considered human beings anymore. We're considered data points in a statistical analysis. And nowhere is this more present than in the coronavirus measures that have been put in place. And my wife is an ICU nurse, and for the longest time, it's changed a little bit now. Whether or not someone had COVID or not, if they're at the end of their life, their family couldn't be with them when they're dying, right? And the death of a family member, a lot of times, and not always, I've talked about this before, brings healing, right? It brings some sort of closure, some sort of healing where different relationships in the family that were strained can come together in the event of, let's say, grandpa dying, and that's a healing event. Regardless of all that, you're taking away the ability of families to be together when their loved one is dying. And with the idea of, if we let families be together with someone that, whether or not they have COVID or not, there's a statistical chance that there's that they will spread COVID X amount
They
more.
might catch a flu. Yeah.
Therefore, we should keep them from doing it because they're not human beings anymore. They're just disincarnate, fungible units that are.
Well, maybe if COVID was actually like bad, like it was actually like a disease that was worth giving a shit about, like if it was like the Black Plague or something,
Yeah.
maybe we could understand this stuff.
Exactly. Well,
But,
that's some people say, I wish this thing was worse. So we'd have, there would be some weight behind these measures because, it's like, I talked about this the other day. It's like so much uncertainty with COVID that has been propagated through fearful tactics through the media and whatnot, right? For so long, berating human beings with these expressions of fear, they're going to lose their ability to rationalize, and they're going to just latch on to either absurd authority, right? No matter how absurd the measures the authorities put in place, they're the authority and things are falling apart. So I'm going to latch on and hold on till for dear life, or they're going to latch on to any conspiracy theory, like the craziest conspiracy theory, and they'll latch on to that because I would rather have absurd certainty than this kind of uncertainty with all of this constant flux of fear and whatnot. And it's like, that's actually happening. And the strange part is you're seeing people in my neighborhood, people that I know well, that are completely falling into these bits of irrationalism, whether it's masks or whether it's the vaccine. Like all of a sudden now everybody has to take it. Like they keep moving the goalposts, like 15 days to slow the spread. Now there's states that have been locked down for a year, and now we're going to develop a vaccine, and that's going to help us. Now everybody, now they're doing it to children. Everybody should take this vaccine, and my family is the only family on my street, and the people that we hang out with, our close group, the only family that hasn't gotten a vaccine, right? And my wife, who is not political at all, is not against vaccines in general, and works in the ICU at ground zero. Her intuition is, I'm not taking this thing. Like, so I'm following her, right? Because she doesn't care at all about politics, doesn't get involved at all. And her general intuition is like, no, I'm not taking this thing.
the logic of it doesn't even make sense because they say like it doesn't even prevent transmission. The way that it works is it like gets your body to attack proteins inside your lungs that the disease would attach itself to. So it still goes into your lungs and can be exhaled out of your lungs. It just like reduces, like makes it like so it can't cause all these negative symptoms.
And it makes you sick.
That's the logic that they give, right?
Yeah.
Like for the vaccine. And so it's like, well, if if this vaccine works, you can fucking take it if you want to, but why do I have to? Oh, because you could spread it to other people. Well, I can spread it to other people whether I take it or not. So what difference does it fucking make if I take it or not? I'd rather get the flu that it is. It's like not even as bad as a flu.
For most people, there's
coronaviruses,
no symptoms.
Like, do you know what they call all the other coronaviruses that exist? Because it's not the first coronaviruses. We call them common colds.
Colds. It's the cold.
Yeah. So it's like, fucking come on, man. Like, it's the whole thing is a psyop, in my opinion. You said like people latching onto like crazy conspiracy theories, and yeah, there is a lot of that.
They had
I think there is a conspiracy.
Our Amazon boxes. They had us spraying down our Amazon boxes. Like we've known coronavirus since the 70s. And you're telling me that this particular coronavirus tells you, we don't know if masks works. Oh, no, they work and you have to wear them. We were spraying down our groceries. Like they had us spraying down our groceries. Like, what the hell is that? Like it's insanity. And that's like, you've been studying coronaviruses for so many years. This is different because it's got a particular spike protein on it, right? And that they built this vaccines in such a short period of time. They've been trying to find a coronavirus vaccine for forever. Yeah, and the average time is 5 years to 10 years to build a vaccine. There's
two ways of interpreting this. Yeah. One is they built it in this short period of time, and we're engaging in this massive experiment, and they don't actually know. They haven't done enough experimentation to know whether it's safe or not. Or the second and more scary possibility is that they'd already had this shit ready, which means this whole thing has been planned, which is what I suspect is the actual truth. And I think that's even more scary than this being a massive experiment. They don't know what it's going to do. I think they might actually know what it does, and I think it does some pretty fucked up shit to you. So yeah,
there's a high probability that that's actually the case, but nobody's going to allow themselves to believe that, right? It just they bet on that, right? So I think there's a very what's to be done, right? There is a through line. There's a way to have discussions, but it's very nuanced to actually thread the needle here. What's to be done here, you think?
Like politically?
Yeah, I mean, politically, familially, like the people around you, your community, conversations like this, what is to be done? How do you thread this line without becoming, how do you affect people to make them realize, like, I don't know, I don't even know how to ask the question, because it's going to get worse. The pressure is going to build up even more. Right. And so how do you can fend it off yourself for a while, but they count on this social pressure, right? This is the big thing, right? They count on this othering, or this being ousted outside in terms of your social group, right? You'll do almost anything to not be put outside your social group, and they're leveraging that through the media, through all these channels, right? And for me, it's like, I don't know, I wouldn't say I'm not affected by that, but I can obviously see it, and I try to poke holes into what I'm looking at. I'm like, maybe I'm just crazy, maybe, but then it's like, so what is to be done here? How do you navigate this landscape that's coming, that's here, and that's going to intensify here?
Well, I think you need to be like inconsistent. Like you need to stand your ground, and you need to show an example to others how to stand their ground. You need to rebuke others for being retarded. Like I think you need to be strong and forth, like just like straight up. I don't think there is uh I think ultimately as well, like there's a necessity for a lot of the people in like dissident communities to kind of get off like the internet and start like moving somewhere where they can like mutually support each other in communities, because we don't have communities anymore really. And I think they were liquefied in like kind of semi on purpose, semi just by the natural processes of technological development. um, and I think we need to like recreate communities in like localism, to be honest, where people can become more self-sufficient, because you can't trust. I mean, like there's a massive movement right now underway to um, get rid of uh, meat production basically, and get
Mm-hmm.
Western countries to start eating all these like eating like the kind of eating the bugs meme. It's like real. There's like, and
Mm-hmm.
there's like people that meet at the Davos group and all these massive globalist corporations that are like meeting and like plotting how they're going to get us all to stop eating meat and start eating like synthetic bullshit that they create in factories or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
This is insane. Like, so I think ultimately, I think we have to kind of like return to being peasants. Like it's almost like maybe we should become Amish or some shit. Like,
Yeah.
because
But
like you have to like start. We have to start taking care of ourselves, because we literally can't trust. Like we live in a hostile society run by probably. I mean, I think they probably are satanic pedophiles. You know what I mean? I don't think that's like it's unironically probably true, run by genuine sociopaths or psychopaths that hate you, and I think want to kill most of us.
Mhm.
So I think you just need to accept this reality, and that means we need to start defending ourselves. We have to start getting organized, and we're
Yeah.
getting organized in a very hostile environment as well. That's going to try and stop us from getting organized. But that's literally the situation. Like the empire's collapsing, the entire global order, which was predicated upon things being a certain way, is having to reorganize itself to resecure its power in the face of the empire collapsing. And that's what
Mhm.
this is. Like it, I don't think, I don't think the 20th century was supposed to. It was supposed to be, like I said at the beginning of the conversation, this kind of end of history, Fukuyama style, where we're all like Russia and China and everything just all became liberal democracies, and everything got like mixed into this globalist soup. And America was the big dick in global affairs. And we just have this like soft encroachment of this like global system being set up. And I don't think it quite worked out. I don't, and I think they made a set of strategic mistakes as to like how they organized the economics and foreign policy of the empire, overstepped their mark, and now they realize, well, we can't just use the American military power and diplomatic power, economic power to just project our ideology on the world. So um, and they're kind of afraid ultimately of losing control of the. I mean, basically, you could like buy off the American and the larger Western population with giving them like prosperity. They're losing the capacity to do all of this,
Mhm.
and so now they have to secure their power in a far more brutal way. And I think that's what ultimately we're seeing. So I think we just have to accept that we're like uh, we're living in hostile times. The people that run the world hate us, and you have to get right with God and like try and organize your communities correctly. And I think this kind of relates back to what I was saying before about also about paranoia. Um, I think ultimately the people who run the world are paranoid.
Mm-hmm.
They're absolutely petrified of losing control, and so they have to keep doubling down, doubling down, doubling down. They're never going to like ease up from here. They're never going to be like, okay, now we feel secure. They're never going to feel safe. Because ultimately, the more they do, the more um, people oppose what they're doing, the more paranoid they become. You know, they've committed all of these atrocities, all of these crimes. They're going to be held responsible if they take a step back, and so they have to keep going.
Mm-hmm.
So I think it's basically like a kind of fight to the death at this point. Like it's either us or them, and
Yeah.
they know it, we don't know it, and that's why we're getting our ass kicked.
Yeah. But it's like, again, who is us, right? Who is us?
Like normal
And
people that are like still that still have like a a soul, that still have like that aren't like totally. You know, you talked about people like the more and more that they have, the more and more ridiculous it becomes. Some people double down where they're like, you know, whether you look at the COVID hysteria or the Black Lives Matter bullshit or the Trump hysteria or whatever, these people are gone. These people are basically walking dead, zombies at this point. But there's people that both actual and potentially kind of can kind of see that there's this like satanic scenario that's kind of emerged here, and that are kind of, I think, can see that are kind of plugged into spiritual truth in a fundamental way, that are, you know, God-fearing individuals in one way or another. um, and just they don't have they don't have hostility. They just want to live a normal life, have normal families, and be normal human beings, and are kind of finding it impossible to just be a normal person without all of this ideology and bureaucracy and bullshit like invading their life. um, and so I think this is where the distinction lies, is between these two groups.
yeah,
um,
yeah. If you got a few more minutes, I wanted to get a couple more things, or you got some time you gotta spend.
yeah, I got
Yeah.
time, man.
So I wanted to see if I can find this critique that I had. I was watching Jason Reza Giorgiani. He was on with John David Ebert, and I saw you had a conversation with him. I've had a few. I've known him for a while, kind of on the internet.
And Giorgiani and Ebert, I know both of them.
So his
Yeah.
idea of I posted on, it was on John David Ebert's conversation with him, and I reached out to him to talk with him. You know, his idea of Promethean, this Promethean ethos, right, that will eventually allow us to, you know, inhabit other planets and become this, you know, kind of leverage this technology that's being leveraged against us and kind of short circuit it and whatnot. It's like, makes me think of what are we to do? What are human beings to do? What are we like? Let's say we get to other planets and we have the same kind of instrumental rationality, this fundamental technological stance on things. What are we going to do? Are we going to go and live with each other and develop, you know, genuine relationships and distribute well-being on other planets? It's like, what are human beings? What are we here to do? And it's like, it goes back to this idea of this whole women are their places in the home. And it's like, no, women need to go out in the workforce. It's like, okay, yeah, but what about the home? What happens there? Why are we focused? Why is our gaze focused on, you know, becoming an 80-hour a week CEO and making you know, ungodly amounts of money? Like, what about the home? Like, what do we do? Like children, raising children and developing families that are cultivate love and developing human beings under this idea of the dignity of a human being. It's like, I don't see that in Giorgiani's project. Like, I didn't see him. I don't have you Do you know his kind of retort to that? Like, what are we to do? Like, what are human beings to do?
Yeah, well, Giorgiani's an interesting character. When I started making public statements that were pro-Christian, he disowned me pretty quickly after that. So we're no
Huh.
longer associates.
Why would
He
he say that?
believes
What would he
he
say to
believes
that?
Christ. Well, Giorgiani believes, I mean, more or less, that the moon is a Martian base where there's a um, basically they're like humans like that existed from Atlantis or some previous civilization that had lived on Mars or something, that destroyed their planet and then genetically engineered humanity, and they're waiting out inside the moon for us to produce the technological singularity, and they like secretly control our political system and siphon off a bunch of resources to build a breakaway civilization, where they siphon off all our technology, and then we're rapidly approaching the technological singularity, at which point they're just going to euthanize the majority of the world population, which is kind of what's happening right now. Take all of our technology and fly off to the stars. And his Promethean ideal is that we should somehow fight them and take the technology to do, like, we should develop a kind of ragtag group to usurp it from them and take it ourselves, but that the majority of the world population is fucked. He believes that Christianity was a psyop that was performed by these aliens, and that he believes there's people in the American deep state that possess video footage of like the staged crucifixion. He had this whole thing that he wrote about how he thought that the God of the Old Testament was basically these aliens with like advanced technology walking around, and that all the miracles that occurred were just expressions of their, like, using energy weapons to level the walls of Jericho or shit like this.
That's an old
So
argument, man. The old Gnostic argument, that the creator of this earth, Yahweh, was himself a demiurge, right? And that our bodies are, in a sense, prisons. This is the whole Gnostic view, and that's we need to get out of these bodies as fast as possible. It's like, really? Yeah. I mean, yeah. The church fathers addressed this from Saint Athanasius and a few other ones, that this argument has been around for a while. And let's just take the logic of that argument. Let's say we usurp these ex-Martians that are on the moon waiting for the technological singularity, and we get off this planet and we come together. Then what do? We go to another planet and do what? Extract resources and minerals from it and develop more technology until what? This process keeps, like, what are we to do?
It comes back to what you were saying before about how you hate like autistic theology, and it's like, when I first converted, the first thing that I read when I opened the Bible, I don't remember exactly why, it was 1 Corinthians. And Paul talks, in the beginning about how like God is glorified in man's foolishness, that no like human wisdom is able to attain knowledge of God in any kind of direct sense. And this is why we need faith. And like, it makes sense. Like if God was to exist, it wouldn't be possible for us to model him, because that would then subordinate God to the conditions of like human intellect, which is incredibly limited. In which case, the human intellect would be sovereign over God, because the human intellect would be capable of like creating a kind of mental representation of like these systemic processes that make him up. In which case, it would just be, why would you even worship such a thing? And so, I think this is what it comes down to. Like, insofar as everything is subordinated to our model of how shit works, we're always placing the human intellect as sovereign over the universe and ourselves and everything. That ultimately all values and decisions and everything emerge from, these models. But then it becomes recursive, because how do we know how to build a model without having a model that told us how to build models? You know what I mean? If we can just keep going on forever in this kind of line of reasoning. And so at some point, you just have to have faith. At some point, you just have to affirm, as you said, like, what's the point of resisting the system or whatever, or resisting this force if you just end up becoming just like it? You just become like, you're just upset at the globalists because you want to be a globalist or whatever, like,
Yeah.
or you're upset at a bunch of Satanists because you want to be the Satanists or something. It's like
the
fuck
feminist
that.
movement. The feminist movement was like, hey, we got to get ours, and they're just being inculcated into what they call toxic masculinity, which is a kind of perversion of masculinity. And instead of the feminism coming and being appreciated for what it is, this whole, I guess toxic masculinity is not the right word. This whole thing has pulled the idea of femininity into it, and now we see movies.
Yeah, like feminism is predicated on like a devaluation of the feminine, that like the feminine role is somehow not inherently valuable, and they need to become like men in order to be liberated or something. It's like you're just applying the very value construct that you're seeking to undermine. Like
and it's quite obvious. It's quite obvious, and it goes back to like it's It's interesting that this whole kind of process and this idea of in the Bible was that Adam and Eve, and Adam and Eve, there's this idea they were individuals, but also Adam is Hebrew for humanity, right? The word means humanity, and then Eve, the word is interpreted in Hebrew as in life, right? So it's like Adam and Eve were individuals, but also they reflect, again, this fractal level, this pattern that scales up and down, right? Adam and Eve, humanity and life, through this process of communing with God, right, would have, and this is, I guess, the idea, right, would have developed, and this is kind of speculation on my part, that, the universe is full of different planets, right? And there could be civilizations, and if you believe the theory of evolution, right, we were kind of rabid animals not too long ago, and then we were apes, and then we became a little bit more, also became Neanderthals, and more civilized, and but we still kept eating each other. We still kept cannibalizing each other. If you look at the history of cannibalism throughout the world, in every culture and every worldview, cannibalism was rampant, right? And it's like, so it's like, hey, you can up-level your civilization. You can become the kingdom of heaven. You can enter the kingdom of heaven, right? But if Christ came and said, stop eating each other. He said, eat from my blood and my body, right? Eat from my blood and my body. Stop eating each other. This whole idea of sacrificing human beings, a lot of times children, to the pagan gods, right, was how to appease the god. And it's like, the idea is like, oh, this wasn't all bullshit. This was all very real, almost too real, right? Where, this idea of how the gods were appeased through human sacrifice. And then you see through the Old Testament, went from humans to animals to incense, right? And then Christ came and it said, essentially kind of stop eating each other. So it's like, if you try to think of it intellectually, it's coherent. But if you think of it in terms of developing a civilization where, that I would want to live in, I would want to live in a place where I believed in the infinite God that presented unconditional love in his son. And then I could share that with others. And in doing so, develop an enriching, like, you know what I'm saying? It makes sense on a lot of levels, and not just like in this kind of reactionary way. And the idea is so brilliant in the Bible of Satan. The most subtle animal came to Eve, right, and said, hey, eat from this apple and you'll become like God, right? And he wasn't lying, because we became like gods, right, with the accumulation of knowledge and technology, but without the wisdom and spiritual maturity. So we have all of this knowledge, and we built the A-bomb, right? But we're still children in terms of spiritually. Yeah, we're still children. We still don't know what to do with it. And eventually, the Bible and all these stories are the fabric of reality, right? The way that the Tower of Babel plays itself out. You had a civilization that, through their own knowledge of good and evil, was building a tower to reach the heavens. And that story is actually interesting, because they weren't building a tower to reach heaven. They were building a tower to bring one of the gods down, right? And it makes me think of what we're doing with AI now. AI is our current Tower of Babel, right? We're building the system in order to bring down one of the gods, in a sense. And what happened? Human beings were dispersed at that point. And this process plays itself out. Like, the end times is a time in history, but it's also a time that's always playing itself out, in a sense. And we're living in the end times in more ways than one, right? Our individual lives will end. So we're always living in end times in terms of individuals, but we're living at the end of this process. And it says in the scripture, and there's this idea that, Christ came and died in order to be resurrected. The church came and now is dead, right? Has fragmented into 50,000 denominations, and now it's dying, right? But this process is inherent in reality, is that after a death, there's a resurrection, right? There is a resurrection. That is not just the story. That is a process that happens in life, but it's also a real process, in a sense. So it's like this idea of like the ark, right? The ark does not have to be a boat. Like, that's what it was in the context of Noah, but the Divine Comedy was an ark, right? It's about leveraging a network and a community of people, like-minded and like-hearted people that worship God, which is still hard to think. I always think of what other people hearing this, like, but they are doing that, right? We need to build an ark. We need to build networks of communities that are cohering together, because things are breaking down right now. Right? Coronavirus is the structures, institutional structures are now falling, right? And we can either pay attention to the falling debris and panic, or we can look at the light shining through that's disintegrating and dissolving the structures. There is light there. And you can train yourself to see it. And that's what faith is. Faith is being able to look up and to actually see the light coming through instead of focused on what's disintegrating. And this idea, what is community, right? Why doesn't communism work? Okay. Communism is community without Christ, right? Christ is the process of unifying multiplicity, right? So communism didn't work because there's no process of unifying multiplicities. There's no shared collective transcendent narrative that we cohere under, right? And there's been many instances of this not working and falling apart, right? But Christ is that process. And I think you're right. I think we do have to build locally, focus locally on the communities that we're building and the people and the relationships that we have around us, really develop and cultivate prayer and the ability to have faith, right? And then share that with others. And I don't know what that's going to look like when you look at the system, right? Because they wanted Christ. The Jews were like, "Oh, good, our political saviors here. We're going to tear out the Romans now. We're going to, realize our political victory here on earth." But Christ is like, "Nope, that's not what we're doing. Right? I'm going to serve. I'm going to wash the feet of my disciples." It's like this idea, I think, gives us a way to comport ourselves towards this demonic, satanic system that is coming at us, right? So I think it's about living Christ's life, right? When they were stoning the Samaritan woman, he wouldn't look the crowd in the eye, because if you look at the crowd in the eye, you'll be sucked into this mimetic process in a sense. So I'm trying to use that, and I don't know exactly what that looks like in our current context. But how do you not look the crowd in the eye in this context? How do you not look for a political solution like this Giorgiani solution of, we're going to usurp the usurpers and all this? Like, that doesn't seem like it's going to, that doesn't seem illogical with regards to the logos. Like, there is the truth, there is reality, like reality exists, and it's not the real of Lacan, right? This thing that, that comes into our symbolic order and makes us realize, it tears us up in a sense. Like, there is reality, right? There is the logos. There is a fundamental pattern to reality. And when you read the Bible in English, it says, "In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God." What the hell does that, like, the Word? God is a word. The God, it's like in the Greek, it's in στην αρχή ήταν το logos. In the beginning was the logos, was the fundamental organizing principle of reality, was the truth. The truth was there, right? And the truth expresses itself as a pattern. The term pattern, the root word is patera, which means father, right? So there is a fundamental pattern to the world that you can tune into, you can cohere with through prayer and faith, right? And in doing so, as things crumble, I think you'll be able to kind of move through into the new. And, because I don't see any other way how things will all of a sudden in our physical, current, political, social environment come back to some sense of normalcy. So I'm with you. Things are crumbling, and there is a path forward, man. I just don't know what that looks like and how to comport ourselves towards what's happening, in a sense.
Well, I mean, like you were saying about Gnosticism, I think it comes down to, Gnosticism, this idea that reality is oppressive, basically. And I see this actually in like Nietzsche's critique of like the ascetic ideal, that like they can't, like the priest can't say yes to life, and so has to cultivate this slave morality in order to like overturn these values predicated upon affirming life in its reality. And Nietzsche, was like, we have to love our fate and all this kind of stuff. But the irony of Nietzsche is, I think the correct reading of Nietzsche is ultimately an affirmation of transhumanism.
Mm-hmm.
And transhumanism is predicated on the idea that humanity isn't good enough. We need to go beyond humanity. Humanity is just a bridge. What do we need more of? We need more intelligence. We need more strength. So in other words, we need to approach omnipotence and omniscience. So basically we need to like become God. We have to create our own gods. As opposed to being thankful. Like if we don't need God, why do we need to build one then? If we need to affirm life, then why can't we just be happy with what we have? Why do you need to keep creating? I like being a normal human being. Like I was saying before, when I grew up, and I thought the circumstances that I grew up in were oppressive or retarded, and now I'm like, wow, that was a dream. Like, if only I could have that same experience. I feel like this is the shift is like being thankful for what's been given to you, because I can't really control like the direction of like humanity. Ultimately, that's something that is I mean, we can participate in it to an extent, uh, but ultimately, like blessings come into our lives, and it's
Mhm.
like and the way that you respond, like if like there's like that parable, and I'm paraphrasing because I don't remember it specifically, but there's that parable that Jesus gives about um, the master lending the servants coins, and one of them invests it, or two of them invest it, and they make returns. And then they say, the master said, "What did you do with the money I gave you?" And we made returns, and the master's pleased. And the other one said, "I buried it in the backyard," and goes and pulls it back out. And then he gets rebuked by the master. He's like, "What's the point of giving you money if you're not going to do anything with it?" In the same sense, what's the point of God blessing us with life and all the beauty and struggles and everything, the whole totality of our lives, if I'm going to do something with it, so I think ultimately, like, I would reject like kind of passivism or whatever. I mean, I'm the kind of person, I'd rather go down swinging than like take a knee to this shit. So like maybe that's what has to happen, but maybe that's a blessing, because maybe maybe it'd be better off dying than having to kind of live in the world that these people are constructing. But hopefully it doesn't come to that. Hopefully instead there's another way. But I think it's about being courageous, having the balls to use what, like, the gifts that we've been given. There's a lot of people in this. I mean, I don't know if you consider yourself part of this movement, but in I consider myself part of this movement called the dissident right or whatever, which is a lot of people returning to not just Christianity, but there's a big portion of it that's about returning to Christianity. Another portion that's um, just returning to tradition in general, or kind of recapturing some of these traditional ideas, repurposing them, rediscovering them, and cultivating some kind of alternative meaning or definition for like the human that Western civilization can provide, other than just more of this like techno bureaucratic bullshit, um, mass democracy, relativism, etc. Um, and there's a lot of great people in this movement. I think like if we could organize these people to create different infrastructure, to create different ways of living, and I think, as a Christian, around Christian principles, I think what who's to say that we couldn't create wonderful things? Like maybe this is an incredible opportunity because the American empire collapses. There's a power vacuum. Maybe we can create some great new kingdom. Maybe we can create a great new um, civilization out of that, ultimately emerges out of this like struggle or whatever. But I think the mentality that we should have is one of being great, like having great gratitude to the divine source of our blessings, and trying to view everything as a blessing, even if it's difficult to see it as one. Like, the Book of James talks about this, like to be like thankful for your trials and tribulations or whatever.
Mhm.
Um, uh, because these are forms of purification. In many ways, we should maybe be thankful for the judgment that our entire civilization is entering into, because we deserve it. Look at all the terrible things that we're doing. Like, look at how retarded society is. I mean, this civilization deserves to be liquefied. It's grotesque. So we should perhaps be thankful
So
and
the
and
term
faithful.
Eucharist, is Greek. For Greek, it's Evcharisto, means thank you. So taking
Hmm.
the Eucharist, right, is literally being thankful in a sense. And I
Yeah,
agree
for
with
like
you.
the body and blood of Christ.
Yeah. There's
But
so much more. And I think someone like you who's going to look at these stories, these ideas with the cultivation of your intellectual capability. But once you combine that, there's this idea in Orthodoxy of, and I think in Catholicism, of the nous, right? The nous is like, it's like the heart mind, right? It's like taking the cultivated intellectual capacity and rooting it in the heart, right? And then becoming a leader and building the new Jerusalem, right? But we have to be careful, I think, with these new, neo post pomo trad, new traditional movements. I think it's people are looking for truth and they're finding truth in older traditions, but it's very easy for these things to become ideologies quickly, right? It's very easy for these things to become, to become manipulated really quickly and become more idols So how do we do that without making it an idol? Like, right? I think, and it goes back again where we started the 10 Commandments, right? Trust and believe in God, be thankful, right? And don't, and love your neighbor as yourself. Like those, Christ said those were the main commandments for a reason. So I think we have to keep going back to that and engaging with that. Really,
Book
really.
I read recently by Robert Filmer, his Patriarcha. I don't know. Have you heard of this text?
Mm-mm.
So it was referenced by John Locke extensively because Filmer's Patriarcha was like the archetypal defense of the divine right of kings in this period in British political philosophy, where you get the emergence of liberalism and the kind of jostling for power between the Whigs and the Tory royalists. And Filmer traces the genealogy, all basically, of authority all the way back to Adam, and he makes the argument that man is not born free, but man is born with a father, and his father is an authority over him. But his father has a father, and a father, and traces all the way back to Adam, who was created by God, and then just makes the argument ultimately that all authority comes from God. And then he points out various different, he quotes the Bible in various different ways to kind of beef up this point. And one, he quotes how in, I can't remember which book it was in the New Testament, it might have been Romans. Anyway, Paul says, even the Roman emperor, who at the time was a pagan, is appointed by God. We must respect his authority, which is radical. Or even if you look at like David, David becomes anointed as a king or as a future king, but Saul's king, and Saul finds out and he's coming after David to kill him. And David has opportunities to kill Saul to defend himself, but he chooses instead to run because he says, no, Saul was also appointed by God, even if he's a wicked man, and I have to wait on God's timing and not take matters into my own hands. And ultimately, eventually God's timing arrives and David becomes king of Israel, and it works out quite well for David and Israel, obviously, in the story. But I think there's a wisdom to this, like, particularly Catholics have to go through this process as well, where it seems like the Pope seems almost like the Pope is questionable at the moment, to say the least. How do you rationalize this? So you have to say, well, this is the Pope that we deserve. Look at how fucking retarded our society is. We don't deserve a noble Pope. We deserve the worst Pope in history. We deserve the worst presidents, the worst kings, the worst authorities. But our job is to be faithful and wait on God's timing to appoint a righteous authority, or perhaps end this farce and send Christ back or whatever.
Yeah.
But so I think that's the correct posture to take, is to be just you've been given, every individual has been given a set of problems, a set of situations, people to take care of, things to solve, certain gifts to maximize, and you have to do the best you can with what's been given, and more will be given to you. To those who it is given, more shall be given, and so forth.
Yeah, I think just to speak to that, when you're saying we're getting the Pope and we're getting the civilization we deserve, I think it harkens to this idea that was powerful for me recently, is what sin is. At least, to a kind of a large portion. Sin, it comes from the Greek. It comes from the Greek word amartia, and amartia comes from archery, ancient archery, which means to miss the mark. And you've probably heard this, right? It means to miss the mark. So if you're aiming individually for the logos, if you're aiming to not sin, if you're aiming to do the right thing, to be truthful, to be a good person, to love others as yourself, right? To sin is to miss the mark, right? And if you sin individually, if you miss the mark for a period of time, individually, your body will disintegrate, you will die, right? And I like to think of someone like Nietzsche or even Deleuze. I like to look at the life of the philosopher, right? How did it end, right? Nietzsche ended in madness and death. And Deleuze, a good reading of Deleuze's death is that he committed suicide because he was gasping for air over, in his townhouse in London, right? So both of them died from madness, in a sense. And you look like someone like Zizek, kind of currently. Well, I appreciate his work in a sense, but he's in a completely paranoid, not, very anxiety-ridden, can't leave his house state, right? So you look at all these people that build these systems, like, what did their actual life look like? like Hegel, Marx, even, like they were completely just, just rotten, hated life, hated their kids. There's this whole idea of Hegel's dialectic, thesis, antithesis, synthesis is a perversion of the Trinity, right? Where the antithesis is a negation, right? Instead of the son coming from the father being an affirmative process, you have thesis, antithesis, which is a negation of the father, right? Because he resented his son. He had a son right before he was going to teach. I forgot the exact story that he resented a lot, right? So this whole thesis, antithesis, synthesis, right, is this process of negation. And that's why we come up with this idea that the subjectivity in itself is made of the void. And at the heart of our personality is this lack that we keep trying to fill, whether it's through our fantasies or through our neuroses and whatnot. It's like, no, that's not the case. Like that's the system that we've built and that we live in. Yes, in a sense, but I think the reality is much different. But this idea of sin, right, is to miss the mark. And if you miss the mark collectively as a civilization for a long period of time, it will necessarily lead to its destruction. And it's such an obvious thing that's happening now. You see the scientists, the very sophisticated scientist type says that, these superstitious people believe that there was this flood and that human behavior caused some sort of flood to happen. And then the same side of their mouth, the other side of the mouth, they say, listen, the global warming is happening and the seas are rising and there's going to be a flood because of your human behavior. Literally, they're selling us because of your sin, because of missing the mark, because of not living appropriately for whatever reason, right? That the flood is coming, that global warming will cause the flood. You're repeating the pattern and you're not even seeing it. And you're telling human beings that, global warming, the seas are rising, Florida is going to be under the water. You're literally saying a flood is coming because of human behavior, right? So there's like a small distinction. It's like this repeating pattern. You try to get rid of religion, you try to get rid of ideas of worship and faith and prayer. They don't go away, right? Because they're part of the structure of reality. So I think don't sin, right? Like it's not some God that is petty and doesn't want you to sleep with another man's wife. That if you live your life where you're not jealous of your neighbor's things, you're not wanting to sleep with your another man's wife, you're not lying to people, and you're not stealing from people, right? If you're doing these things, well-being will proliferate in your life.
I know from experience that when you don't do these things, it sucks. Like when you lie to people, you have to keep thinking about, you have to like maintain what bullshit did I say to this person last time so that you can like figure out what to keep saying. It's stressful. Or when you fraud people, you're always worried you're going to be found out. Or,
Mhm.
if you are sleeping with someone else that you're not supposed to be sleeping with, you're worried that they're going to find out, or you're worried that your relationship or their relationship's going to get ruined by what you're doing, or your friendship's going to get ruined. Whereas if everything's just in order and you're doing things the right way, then like you don't have anything to really, like, nothing's weighing on you. You can just feel satisfied with what you have, and you can and yeah, as you say, like if you like, the I was reading there's these lectures that Pope John Paul II gave in the late 70s and early 80s, and I was reading about I can't remember his name. He's Polish. I can't remember his like birth name. But did you know that he was a Husserlian phenomenologist? Like he was like a philosopher. So in the theology of the body, he brings in phenomenology quite extensively, and he talks about Catholic doctrine of marriage. How, um, like what I was saying earlier about how, wife must, you reference it as well, that wife must submit to man like the church submits to Christ, and man must sacrifice himself and give himself completely to the wife as Christ gives himself to the church.
Mhm.
And so, in Catholicism and I believe Orthodoxy, you have more or less the same principles, or
Mhm.
fundamentalist Baptist, any kind of like genuine Christianity will have these principles that what this means is that, if your wife or husband wants to fuck, then you're fucking, like that's it. Like there's no debate, there's no I'm tired or whatever.
Mhm.
And also there's no pulling out, there's no taking the pill, there's no wearing a plastic bag over your dick. There's none of this.
Mhm.
Um, and what Pope John Paul was saying was, children are created by God, not by man. Who the fuck are you to decide how many kids you have? Your
Mhm.
job is to love your wife and love your husband, and however many kids get made is how many get made. And it's a blessing. You should be thankful however many you produce. Shouldn't be worried about how you got to pay for it or whatever. Trust in the Lord or whatever. Because those children God has a plan for that is independent of whatever you can understand.
Mhm.
Um, and, it's like to me, this is like a very powerful concept. And he was talking, it was almost like, it reminded me of like stuff that I read about Tantra, to be honest, some of the stuff that he was saying, and like the phenomenology of sexuality and so forth. And I mean, it's a long lecture series that he gave over many years. I didn't read all of it. But the principles that he was laying out, it was like, I mean, if you were going to give like marriage counseling, how you're going to enjoy your marriage, it would probably be that. Like if you if both parties give themselves over to one another completely, you're probably going to be pretty satisfied with your wife. She's going to be pretty satisfied with you. You're going to treat each other well, and your marriage is going to be good. You know what I mean? So like if you if you don't lie to people and you don't defraud them and you treat them with honor and you love them as yourself, they're probably going to be they're going to treat you well, and they're going to, you know what I mean? You're going to have good friendships, really. Like everything's going to, it's like, you don't have to really think about it in terms of like, well, I got to trust in God. It's kind of like, this kind of stuff's pretty obvious. Just like you know, if you act with these principles, like it changes like the direct, like the way other people treat you and your life directly in a really fundamental way. So, you know, if you take on all these commandments, like if you really try to like take the Bible and like rigorously interpret it and live by every single commandment, it's probably going to be better than whatever other idea you have about how you should live. Like you're going to create a whole, like who the hell are you to create like a whole way of life out of just like a philosophy or something? Like you're probably going to make a mistake that'll be worse than just do what the Bible says, you know?
Yeah.
Like,
And it,
what's, so go ahead.
no, that's a great point. It's it's a healing mechanism too. Like you follow these rules in a sense, but you know, and it says this in the Bible, you don't tell other people not to sin or point out their sins. You know, Christ says, how do you talk about the speck in your brother's eye when you have a log in yours, right? It's about this participating in the life of Christ. And in doing so, that will spread, right? That's how you spread the kingdom of heaven in a sense. And there's this idea of you know, when you go and find a real spiritual confessor, you find a real spiritual father in that moment. And I think this is what the psychoanalytic is kind of a bastardization of this idea. Because when you go to a psychoanalyst, they stand rationally against you, and they're writing down compared to their theories of the different neuroses that you're talking about. They're either going to prescribe cognitive behavioral therapy or they're prescribe medication, right? When you find a real spiritual confessor, which are probably, they're very rare these days, right? You go to confession and you confess your sins and God forgives you. What does that mean? That means the priest is not there to judge you. The priest says, you know, I'm a sinner just as you. And in that confession, that's one of the mysteries, one of the sacraments. In confessing your sins, right, God takes your sins, right? And in doing so, you're healed. It heals your heart and it purifies your heart. And literally you become I hate the term better person, right? You'll become a better father, a better husband, a better friend if you find a spiritual confessor and you confess, because the love that God has, right? This love of Christ that is present when you're giving confession, it's healing, right? And this same thing, like if you're following the commandments and you're doing it with love and you're praying and you're communing with God, not only will your relationships start working out, but they'll heal others. You'll heal others. You'll heal the hearts of others in the sense of their relationships with their parents, or, you know, and you cannot do it by telling them what to do. You shouldn't drink. You shouldn't be doing this. That's not what it looks like. I think it just looks like, I don't know what it looks like, but it, you know, it feels a certain way, right? And I think if you practice it and you're getting into it, and I've gotten into it, and I'm very mindful of, you know, I had a very bout with Taoism, and I was really into meditation, and I had a huge inflated spiritual ego, and I had developed the relationships with spiritual beings, Metatron, right? Like the crazy stuff, right? And from my perspective, I was like
the transformer.
No, the angel, the actual spiritual being, which was
I'm making a joke.
no, yeah, no, I thought, because a lot of people,
Yeah.
I had his statue and whatnot, so a lot of people aren't aware, you know, of Metatron in a sense. And he came to me, and I would have crazy experiences in deep meditative states of, you know, and I thought I was so special, and I thought I had information that other people didn't have, and I was going to help heal people, right? And I was just a fucking asshole. I was an asshole, and I had this thing that's chirped in my mind always: you got to divorce your wife if you're going to go around, travel the earth and teach and heal. Like, it's, you know, crazy as shit, right? It's from the inside. I'm participating in ascension. I'm having an awakening. You guys, you know, you don't understand. And my wife, I swear to God, she's an angel, man. She stuck with me, right? And through it all, right? And like I get emotional when I talk about this a lot, because it's like she stuck with me, and I almost lost it all. I had one son at the time, and I have three kids, and things, I can't say that they're better in a certain way, not materially, but they're better in a certain way where like I can be present with my kids, and I really care about my wife, and I want to sacrifice for her, and I want to keep following that when that's happening. But the point was, I'm still mindful of not falling into this inflated spiritual ego thing. And that's why I'm really struggling with understanding and embodying humility. What is humility? Like, I think that's a key, and the fathers talk about that. That's a key thing to understand and to embody is humility. And that's where I'm kind of at and working at right now. But I think
You know,
it's,
I feel that because I'm not like some excellent Christian or something. So, uh, I'm like a noob Christian or whatever, I guess. And
so am I, man,
yeah, yeah. But like, all I'm saying is like, it's in the Bible. Like, don't come to me asking me what to do. Go talk to a priest. You know what I mean? Talk to
Yeah.
someone else. I don't want to be like a spiritual authority. All I can do is just kind of testify my experiences,
Yeah.
how I feel. But I feel like as well, that's the paradox as well of Jesus Christ. He's like the greatest leader in world history, but he was like ultimately humble.
Mm-hmm.
And so like it's it's kind of like the idea of, well, if someone wants to be in charge, maybe they shouldn't be or whatever. That's a common trope. Um, whereas like what Jesus showed and said was, well, he subordinated himself to the Father, because the Bible teaches that Jesus was like God. I mean, he was God. He was born as God, so he didn't need to subordinate himself to the Father insofar as, well, he could do what he liked. He was God. You know what I mean? But he chose to do so, and this is, I think, something that maybe isn't emphasized enough. Like the fact that he did choose to do this. Like, the fact that Jesus had agency. He could have done things a different way, if he wanted to. I mean, he's God. He could do whatever the hell he wants.
Mm-hmm.
The fact that he chose to do things in a very specific way, like, there's probably like this really great wisdom to that we should like pay attention to and say, well, why that particular way? You were talking about that's kind of like the final red pill, that all religions are true, I guess you could say. So like communing with like all these other spiritual entities, maybe those spiritual entities are not necessarily completely malevolent. Some of them, I mean, they
Mm-hmm.
might be like, some of them have like some, but it's like there's nothing malevolent about the figure of Christ, like as far as I can tell. Like if you like read the Gospels, like it's like the most perfect description of like how to, like every single moral prescription that he gives is just like the most pure-hearted kind of way of interpreting a situation. So yeah, like I don't think I'm capable of being like that, because I mean, I'm nowhere near of that capacity. But at least I can have the humility to say, well, that's probably how, like, you should look to that person as an example, um, not not me or someone like that I think is cool or whatever. Uh,
Mm-hmm.
and I think so. I think that's what it's about, is like respecting authority and staying in your lane to a certain extent, rather than, well, that's the kind of the temptation, I guess, particularly as an intellectual type, is like, you talked about like arrogance, or inflated ego. Like you build all this knowledge, you build all of this understanding. You think you have access to this special domain, and you think, I'm better than other people. Um, you know, uh, when at the end of the day, like, ultimately you're not Jesus Christ, you're not God. Like, you have flaws. Like, who the hell are you ultimately? I think this is a good question. Like, uh, you know, and that kind of like down to earthness. Ultimately, if you were going to lead something, you would probably have more chance at being a leader that people respected if you were down to earth. If you did humble yourself and point to other authorities and point to other notions outside of your own constructions, and examples outside of yourself. Eventually, people say, "Well, look at this guy. He's not. He's pointing to all these other things. He's trying, like, I think I made a tweet about this. It was like leadership is being the first to obey.
Mm-hmm.
I got this, because Christ was the first to obey God in not in like not in like a historical sense. Obviously, people obeyed God before Jesus Christ, but he was the first to obey in like the absolute sense. Like his obedience contextualizes all other obedience. So he's like first spiritually to obey. And so, like, in what situations in life can you be first to obey? That's like powerful. I think that's more like, I think the real model of leadership, what it would be like, is something along these lines. So like, it's not so much humility as in no, like just completely taking responsibility away from yourself and saying like, I have no responsibility to be an authority because this is bullshit. Like people need to be everything. All social relations are like just talking when someone else is listening is being an authority. Everything is authority.
Mm-hmm.
um uh but like so the question is how to engage an authority when it's bestowed upon you, particularly as a man. If you're going to be a husband and a father, you're going to be an authority. If you're going to participate in any communal activity, if you're going to you're going to be involved in business, you're going to be involved in anything. If you're not going to be an absolute and like an abject loser, you have to like take authority. So the question is how. And I think I think like, I think again, biblical teaching kind of just lays it out.
Yeah, I think you said it beautifully, and I think it's that's where the saints come in, right? The idea in the Orthodox religion is to become a saint. Doesn't mean to become a hermit or what we think of a saint is. That means just closer to God. And there's a lot of people that had our particular passions, right? My passion, has been addiction in my life, substances and just chasing kind of high experiences, whether it's a spiritual meditation experience or substances, alcohol, opiates. Had a past, it's been my past, but also intellectual consideration. Like my priest told me, I came to him with all these church father stuff. He's like, stop reading, like just stop reading. Not that reading's bad or reading the church fathers bad. It's like that your passion is inflamed in a sense, and there are, and I'm gonna, I'll let you go here, man. I kept you way longer than we had scheduled, but the saints are beautiful, beautiful placement here in terms of what you're talking to, right? Develop a relationship like I'm developing a relationship with saints like Saint Gregory Palamas. He's somebody that I would recommend, and he's a 13th century. He was the Archbishop of Thessaloniki in Greece, and he was defending the Hesychast tradition against the Hellenic philosophers of the 13th century, and he just goes beautifully in a wonderfully, beautifully beautiful way, just taking down the arguments of the Gnostics, of Hellenic education, of science and whatnot. I'll share with you. I did a couple of readings on my channel just last week of two chapters from the book. I think he's a good saint, I think, to build a relationship with. And I've started engaging with the saints, and I'd start reading them, and then I would get the icon, and I'd put the icon up when I'm reading it, and it's like you can develop relationships with these saints in a sense, and have them be the authority, right? There's nothing new under the sun. Everything that you're going through, these saints who have become close to God, right? Who've become, with God in a sense, follow them. Don't follow me. Don't follow, follow them. And it took a while for me to consider that. Like, what do you mean the saint? You know what I'm saying? But it's a powerful tool. So it's there, man. It's there in the tradition. It's there. We just got to look with it, and we, and cultivate the eyes through prayer
There's
to
an
look.
interesting like Deleuzian point to make here, actually, like to kind of cycle back, maybe
Yeah.
like as the last thing that I say for this, because you said before, I think this is apt, like, Deleuze has this like fidelity to novelty. Like why does everything need to be new all the time for, Um uh but there's like an like what I got from Deleuze's critique of Hegel, which I think is profound, because you talked about how Hegel um ultimately you have to move into negation in order to then eventually get um to the concrete from the abstract or whatever. And so you have this like supplementation of void, which is the self, as like that like kind of like powers the dialectic, um which is again kind of like a weird parallel to that what I was describing about like the the metaphysics of like mass democracy requiring this like form without content or whatever. But Deleuze's critique is of Hegel as a representationalist, this idea. So we have the thesis, we have the abstract notion. How do we get beyond it to the next notion? We have to negate it. We have to oppose it so that we can then synthesize it. And Deleuze says no, like there's difference already within. Like difference comes prior to identity. There's already internal difference in that notion. You can keep like reinterpreting the same. You don't need to keep inventing new notions. So if you have something that's profound, there's an infinite amount of interpretations. So like whether you look at like church fathers or the figure of Christ himself, it's like answering the question, how do I be Christ-like in this situation, has an infinite amount of answers. Like every situation is going to be different. And so there is, in a sense, this generative newness that comes from fidelity to the same, because ultimately, insofar as Christ makes a difference in a particular situation, there is, Christ inhabits that situation in a new way, unlike any other situation. And so it's not like you have to be like bureaucrats that subordinate everything to, this is the representationalist lie, that like there is only one specific definitional meaning, and that proposition only has one interpretation, and that's what it means. Instead, no, there's like these notions and these concepts, and they're spiritually vivacious. They're alive. They have this like capacity for perpetual generation. They have it like, difference like that iterates perpetually. The example that I gave in my YouTube series was, you think about in Batman comics, like the Joker. There's all these different Jokers and all these different movies, and then you've got like the different Batman comics. They have different authors. They're not all written by one author, so then they interpret things differently. And there's different directors, and then there's video games, and there's different TV series and cartoons. There's an infinite amount of, like, not an infinite amount, but there's like a shitload of different Jokers. But like there's like the theme, the idea of the Joker, and it can keep being reinterpreted because it's kind of like a really interesting figure. And it's culturally influential every time. Like even the movie they made a couple of years ago, that made a big impact. I reckon they'll probably make more movies in the future that'll have the Joker depicted that'll also be interesting, like, and it will continue to be culturally relevant because there's something about the character that represents something really profound. And if that's true for the Joker, what about for Jesus Christ, or what about all these like religious themes? So I think that like dichotomy of like bureaucratic traditionalist versus creative free thinker, I think it's BS. Like I think.
Yeah, no, that beautifully said. I couldn't agree more. And that's the collapse between the medium and the message that's kind of came up to me, right? That McLuhan talks about. Yeah, man, that was beautifully put. And I really appreciate your time. And I thought that I was, going to come and I was going to give you a little bit of a Christian apologetic and get some pushback, but I didn't know you were kind of going through these machinations, and it's a real beautiful thing. And I appreciate your time in this conversation and sharing with me very much, man. So I'll share a bunch of your stuff in the description when I share this. And it was really wonderful, man. I hope we can do it again sometime for sure.
Yeah, I enjoyed it, man. Thanks.
Yeah, dude. Thanks, man. God bless. Enjoy the rest of your day.